Hey guys, if you were born a Viking fisherman, the very first thing you'd hear, before your eyes even opened, before your lungs had finished their first wailing gasp, wouldn't be lullabies or soft words of welcome, but rather the distant crash of waves against the rocky shore, a guttural bark from a dog outside the hut, and your mother's sharp hiss of pain as she finished pushing you into a world that's cold, damp, and absolutely not interested in your comfort. You arrive in a small, smoky hut, somewhere near the edge of a fjord, so cold it could shatter your toes if you dipped them in for too long. And the roof above you is patched with dried moss, cracked driftwood, and the occasional bone. Because if something is strong and vaguely waterproof, it's good enough to be part of a Viking house. You're red-faced and howling, squirming in your mother's arms as your skin meets air that is brisk even by Scandinavian standards. And someone, a grandmother or a neighbor or maybe a sheepish uncle with fish guts on his sleeves, wraps you quickly in thick, coarse wool that scratches against your tiny, goose-pimpled skin, muttering something about you being loud and healthy and already acting like a true fisherman with lungs that could wake the dead and probably scare off the fish. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching this somewhere cozy, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Whether you're under the blanket in Oslo, curled up in a dorm room in Dublin, or tucked into bed in Buenos Aires pretending you're anywhere but Monday morning. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your father is outside, which isn't surprising because Viking men don't do much in the birthing department unless there's a rope to cut or a large celebratory mug of ale involved. And in this case, he's probably busy mending nets or gutting fish or hauling in the morning's catch while your mother grits her teeth and births you, like she's done it before, like she's squatted in snowdrifts and done it while wolves howled in the distance because, well, she probably has. Your parents aren't royalty or warriors or even particularly ambitious, but they are survivors. Tough, weathered folk with wind-burned cheeks, cracked hands, and a sense of humor so dry it might be legally classified as jerky. Your mother, strong and stocky with a braid long enough to wrap around your squirming body twice, cleans you with a cloth that smells faintly of seal fat, then holds you up toward the flickering light of an oil lamp and declares that you look like your grandfather, which is to say, squinty, bald, and slightly confused. The hut is barely tall enough for anyone to stand in, with walls that lean just a little too far inward and a floor that's mostly packed earth and straw. But it's warm enough, thanks to a low fire in the hearth and a pile of smoldering coals nestled under a cauldron of fish stew that's been simmering since last Tuesday. The air smells like wood smoke, brine, wet wool, and onions that have seen better centuries. And while your first cries echo through the room, a few chickens shuffle indignantly in the corner, unimpressed with your dramatic arrival. Outside, the fjord stretches endlessly, a deep blue-gray expanse carved by ancient glaciers and haunted by the wind, which whistles through the narrow gaps in the rocks like an old man singing badly on purpose. The water is frigid, alive, and home to fish that are neither particularly intelligent nor cooperative, and that's what your family depends on. You're born into a lineage not of raiders or kings, but of people who rise with the tide and fall asleep to the sound of dripping boats and creaking rope. While some of your distant cousins are out swinging axes and pillaging monasteries in far-off lands, your family's glory lies in the size of their catch and the consistency of their dried cod. The midwife, whose only qualification seems to be her advanced age and general disinterest in your crying, grunts with approval as she pats your rump once for good luck and announces to no one in particular that this one's got legs strong enough for rowing. Just you wait. Which might be a compliment or a curse, depending on how much you enjoy the idea of spending most of your life hunched over a wooden oar in sleet. As the hours pass and your shrieking fades into twitchy sleep, your mother swaddles you tighter and holds you close to her chest, muttering soft, rhythmic words in Old Norse, something between a prayer and a weather report, while rocking you gently as though you're already a small boat trying to stay upright in a choppy sea. Outside, the day inches forward. A neighbor stops by with a half loaf of barley bread and news about a dead seal washing up near the point. Your father eventually returns, boots muddy, hair tousled by the salty wind, and eyes red-rimmed from squinting against the glare off the water. He's not particularly sentimental, but he crouches down beside your mother, peers at your squishy pink face and nods. "He'll do," he says, and then promptly sneezes from the smell of old fish and childbirth. Your first hours on Earth pass without ceremony or swaddling blankets woven by angels. There's no golden cradle or lullaby, only the rhythms of everyday life. The splash of water in a wooden bucket, the soft slap of fish being cleaned just outside the door, the muted conversation between your parents about whether they still have enough turnips stored for spring, and the whistle of a kettle that, frankly, never whistles properly. And yet, in this plain, practical world, there's a kind of beauty in the way everything fits together. Not perfect, not polished, but real. You're small, but not the smallest child the midwife's ever seen. Your head is oddly shaped, as all heads are when they're new and squished from travel, and your fingers curl around anything they touch, like the edge of your mother's sleeve or the tail of a startled kitten. You weigh about as much as a freshly caught mackerel, which means you're just light enough to be carried in a sling while your mother goes about her business of hanging clothes, tending fires, and occasionally glaring at your older brother when he pretends to fish in the drinking water barrel again. No one expects much of you yet, not because they doubt you, but because you're a newborn, and in a Viking fishing village, babies are mostly judged by their ability to not immediately freeze, fall into the hearth, or choke on their own fists. If you make it through your first winter, and that's still a pretty big if, then perhaps you'll be considered promising. For now, you're just a tiny, squirming bundle wrapped in wool, sleeping fitfully while your family's dog curls up near your feet, as if already staking claim to your companionship for years to come. And the world outside, it doesn't pause for your arrival. The tides still shift, the wind still howls, the cod still swims somewhere deep in the black water. Life moves forward with or without your permission, but now you're in it. Just another life wrapped in the rhythm of boats, nets, storms, and the endless hunger that pulls men toward the sea again and again, no matter how cold the morning or how rough the waves. Your first winter comes not as a surprise, but as a certainty, creeping over the fjord with a slowness that fools no one. Brushing the grass first with frost, then icing the water buckets, then finally settling itself thickly across every surface like an unwelcome but expected guest who eats all the salted meat and still complains about the draft under the door. You're barely a few months old, still more lump than boy, with a head that wobbles like a badly lashed cargo crate on stormy seas, and a neck that gives up entirely when gravity gets involved. But you're alive, which, in the grand scheme of Viking infant survival statistics, is already a minor miracle. The cold is not simply cold in the way most people think of it. It is a creeping, clawing presence, something that finds its way in through every seam and stitch and crack in the wall. And no matter how tightly your mother wraps you in reindeer hide or how close she pulls you against her body under the shared fur blanket, it still manages to reach in, brushing your tiny toes with its icy fingertips as if to test your resolve. The fire burns low at night because wood is precious and not to be wasted just to make you comfortable. And so the smoke hangs thick in the room, mingling with the scents of dried fish, boiled onions, and unwashed wool, creating a sort of sour, sleepy fog in which your baby lungs cough and snort and hiccup their way into the new year. Your crib, if you can call it that, is little more than a hollowed-out log lined with straw, padded with a sheepskin that smells faintly of lanolin and dirt, and a lot like the sheep it used to be. It rocks slightly when bumped, which is both calming and dangerous, depending on whether or not your brother has decided to turn it into a boat and shove it toward the fire pit again. During the day, you are carried in a sling across your mother's chest or back, your small body pressed against hers like an extra heartbeat, and you learn to nap to the rhythm of her footsteps, the sway of her shoulders, the sharp clatter of ladles, and the occasional muttered Norse profanity when something boils over. Your father doesn't hold you much, not because he doesn't care, but because he doesn't really know how. Not in the way of cooing or bouncing or playtime, but in the way of showing up with a smoked fish wrapped in linen and saying, "For the boy," before setting it beside you and going back out into the freezing wind to curse at the ice-crusted nets. He works from dawn until dusk, or longer if the moon is high and the tide right. And the only time he stops is when his fingers grow so numb that the knots slip from his grip like eels. He's tall, broad, and stoop-shouldered from years of hauling boats over rocks, with a beard so thick it holds icicles and a voice that sounds like gravel being stirred in a wooden bowl. But when he leans over your cradle and peers at you through those ice-blue eyes, there's a softness there that even the winter can't quite freeze away. And then there is your first cod. You don't catch it, obviously, because your hands are too small and your coordination is roughly on par with a drunk goose. But you are present for it nonetheless. Your father brings it in just after sunrise, cradling it like a treasure, its scales still shimmering with the oily sheen of sea mist and moonlight. It is nearly as long as your body, its mouth gaping in perpetual protest, its fins still twitching faintly as if unwilling to admit defeat. Your mother beheads it with one quick swing of her blade. No ceremony, no thanks, just efficiency, and proceeds to gut it in a practiced flurry that leaves her hands red and the floor slick. The innards are tossed to the chickens, who descend upon them with a level of enthusiasm that suggests this is the most exciting part of their week. That cod feeds your family for days. Your mother salts some of it, boils the rest with turnips and stale beer, and even fries a bit in leftover seal fat as a kind of celebratory treat. You suck on a sliver that's been mashed and chewed for you until it's little more than warm goo, your gums working at it while your eyes go wide from the flavor. Salty, fishy, and oddly comforting, like being hugged by a very damp uncle. From that moment on, cod is not just food, it is lifeblood. It is the answer to every question. What's for dinner? Cod. What are we trading with? Cod. What did we forget to pack for the voyage? Cod, probably. Your world revolves around the sea and what it provides, and nothing it gives is more precious or more defining than that humble, slippery fish. As the weeks crawl by, your body grows slowly, wrapped in layer after layer of wool and hide. Your cheeks perpetually flushed from the cold. Your nose running so constantly it becomes a sort of glistening decoration. Your ears, small and pink, catch the sound of the sea at all hours, lapping gently against the rocks when the weather is kind, or slamming against the hulls of beached boats when the wind picks up and the gods feel moody. You don't yet know what thunder means, but you know to flinch when it rolls across the mountains like a barrel full of boulders, and you don't yet understand the tide. But your eyes follow it as it creeps up and recedes like a breathing beast. The animals around you are more accepting of your presence than most people. The dog sleeps beside you most nights, warming your toes and occasionally snuffling your ear with a cold, wet nose. The chickens tolerate you so long as you don't pull feathers, which you inevitably do, and the goat regards you with the same blank stare it offers to gods and fence posts alike. The seagulls, however, are your sworn enemies, loud, obnoxious creatures that try to steal bread straight from your mother's hands and have no sense of personal space. Quirky fact, someone in your village swears that once a gull stole a baby's wool cap, wore it, and squawked triumphantly from the top of a longboat mast for 2 days, until someone finally shot it down with a poorly aimed arrow. No one knows if it's true, but it gets repeated often enough that the story now belongs to everyone. There's no such thing as baby toys in your world. Instead, you gnaw on spare bits of leather, chew driftwood, and sometimes, accidentally, small bones. You are more likely to be handed a fish bladder to squish than a carved figurine. And your version of a rattle is a jar of dried peas that your brother forgot to seal. But despite the lack of refinement, you are entertained. And when your siblings aren't too busy chasing each other around the hut or pretending to hunt bears in the snowdrifts, they take turns dangling shiny fish scales above your head and laughing when you try to grab them with your pudgy hands. The village itself doesn't sleep much. Not really. Even in winter, there's work to be done. Nets to repair, boots to patch, sleds to oil, fish to dry over smoky fires that never go out. And above all, preparations to make for the coming thaw, when the ice will crack and the water will open its mouth wide again, ready to give or take whatever it pleases. You grow up listening to these sounds, absorbing them, letting them become part of your own inner rhythm, so that even now, when you dream, the soft rasp of a blade sharpening on stone feels like a lullaby. And all this, your first winter, your first cod, your first taste of fishy porridge eaten off a spoon carved from driftwood, folds into you like layers of wool, forming the core of who you are and who you'll become. Not a raider, not a poet, not a legend, but something just as steady and far more necessary. A Viking fisherman born of cold, fed by tide, and bound to the sea like a net to a boat. As the days begin to stretch their fingers just a little further past the horizon, and the snow reluctantly starts to give way to slush, then mud, and finally the first tentative blades of green. Your first spring arrives not like a celebration, but like a slow exhale, a grudging thaw that leaves behind puddles, aching joints, and the overpowering smell of damp wool drying too close to the hearth. You are now a little older, not quite walking, but certainly crawling with a grim determination that suggests you're auditioning for a life of slipping on boat decks and tripping over stray ropes. And your body, once small and soft like a bundle of moss, has hardened slightly. Your hands now grip tighter, your cries carry further, and your eyes no longer glaze over passively, but instead follow every flickering shadow and passing face with the seriousness of a fisherman inspecting bait. The longhouse where you live is still dim, still smoky, still crowded with the daily business of survival. But the door is now open more often, letting in a light that's not exactly warm, but at least less accusing. And for the first time, the scent of earth begins to edge out the bitter tang of snow. Your mother, always busy, always multitasking with the deftness of someone who's learned how to stir a pot, spin wool, nurse a baby, and shout instructions to two arguing children without once looking up, carries you on her hip while she hums tunelessly, sometimes bouncing you slightly, as if trying to lull you into cooperation through vibration alone. Outside, the village begins to hum as well, not in song, but in rhythm, a quiet industry that fills the air with scraping, hammering, swearing, and occasionally the sound of a distant sheep making a dramatic complaint. Nets are checked and rechecked, repaired with nimble fingers that seem to know by feel alone which knots will hold and which will betray you at sea. Boats are hauled from their frozen moorings, their hulls examined for cracks, barnacles scraped from their sides with the same intensity you might reserve for a battle wound, and oars are sanded, patched, or outright replaced when they give that telltale groan that means, "Leave me on shore or lose me mid-row." Your father is up before the light, as always, and now that the ice has pulled back from the edge of the fjord like a sulking child finally called inside, he returns to the water with a reverence that almost resembles religion. He checks the tide with narrowed eyes, spits into the wind for reasons no one ever questions, and sets out in a boat that creaks like an old man telling a long-winded story. When he returns, which is sometimes by mid-morning, and other times not until twilight threatens to swallow the whole sky, he brings with him stories that are almost certainly exaggerated. Fights with stubborn fish, rival fishermen stealing favored coves, a gull that tried to dive straight into the boat and missed by just a thumb's width. But alongside the stories, he brings back fish, and that's what matters. You watch him from the doorway now, because you've figured out how to crawl that far and wedge yourself under the threshold in a way that allows you to see without being in the way. Your siblings bustle past you, older and louder and constantly in motion, and you try to mimic them with grunts and wobbly gestures that your mother pretends not to notice but secretly finds amusing. One day soon, you'll be up on 2 feet too, chasing chickens and falling into troughs and demanding your own share of dried cod snacks. But for now, you are the observer, the little barnacle clinging to the edges of family life, soaking in every moment. And while the rest of the village turns its energy outward, to the boats, the nets, the water, you begin turning yours inward, toward the slow and steady business of growth. Your teeth begin to arrive, sharp little reminders that you are indeed a predator in training, and you gnaw on anything you can get your hands on. Bits of driftwood, leather scraps, the unfortunate corner of your brother's tunic. Your voice finds new pitches, some joyous, some furious, and some apparently reserved for alarming the livestock, and your arms begin to reach with more intention toward bowls, toward spoons, toward anything shiny that looks like it might be licked. Mainstream fact of the day: Viking children were often weaned around the age of 2 or 3, sometimes even later if food supplies were low, which means you still spend a considerable amount of time latched to your mother while she works, half asleep with one eye open, occasionally yanked off her hip when she needs both hands to gut something. And while there's nothing romantic about it, no polished cradle songs, no embroidered bibs, it is, in its own way, intimate and enduring. This bond between you and the woman who feeds you, warms you, and keeps one hand protectively on your back, even while chopping turnips with the other. Spring brings its own dangers, of course. The snowmelt makes the ground treacherous, the river swollen, the rocks slick with moss and spite. The chickens, emboldened by the warmer air, become more territorial. And one particularly aggressive hen has taken to guarding your cradle as if it's her own nest, pecking anyone who comes too close. Your mother swats her away with a practiced hand, muttering that the gods must have sent you a protector in feathered form, though your father suggests just eating her and being done with it. The hen lives on, unbothered. The boats now go out daily, and when they return, the village transforms into a flurry of activity. Fish are cleaned and hung to dry. Guts are fed to the dogs or buried in shallow pits. Heads boiled for stew or packed for trade. And children are sent scurrying about with errands that often involve getting wet, getting scolded, or getting distracted by frogs. You are still too small to help, but you begin to recognize the smell of fish as something good, something that brings people together even when their hands are bloody and their feet frozen, something that means survival, trade, maybe even stories around the fire if the catch is large enough and the night long enough. And speaking of stories, every night after the chores are done and the fire burns low and the pot of stew simmers quietly in the corner, your father speaks. Not long-winded speeches or carefully crafted tales, but short bursts of memory. The time the boat nearly capsized. The time lightning struck a tree so close the bark rained down on him. The time a fish leapt so high it knocked his hat clean off. Your siblings giggle, your mother rolls her eyes but smiles, and you, wide-eyed and drooling into a strip of cloth, listen with a seriousness far beyond your years. Quirky fact: some Viking fishermen believed certain fjords were cursed, that spirits of drowned sailors whispered from beneath the water and pulled at nets just to play tricks. Your father claims he once heard his own name called from the deep, but he just told it to shut up and rowed harder. No one knows if he's joking, but no one asks either. Your nights grow quieter, now that you sleep a little longer and cry a little less. You've learned the difference between silence and danger, between a lull in conversation and the alert pause that comes before someone rushes to the door. You dream, though you won't remember what of, Perhaps boats, or shadows, or the warmth of your mother's side when the wind howls through the roof cracks. But you dream all the same. And when you wake, the world is always still there. The smoke, the cod, the dog, the noise, the life. You don't yet know that you are being shaped by these days, molded like clay, not by a sculptor's hands, but by wind, salt, hunger, and the slow rhythm of life that repeats and repeats until it feels like destiny. You are becoming, slowly and stubbornly, exactly what the fjord demands. Tough, quiet, curious, and just a little fishy. By the time your legs begin to hold your weight, wobbling at first like a willow in wind, and then, more confidently, like a seal pup testing the firmness of coastal rock. The world seems both larger and smaller at once. Larger because you can now move through it under your own power, no longer confined to the sling on your mother's back or the crook of her arm, and smaller because your territory becomes a loop. From the hearth to the fish racks, to the chickens, to the water barrel, and back again, over and over, as if your tiny feet are tracing the first lines of a map that has no compass but is already full of stories. You toddle with the exaggerated urgency of someone who's been watching everyone else for months and now believes they too must rush everywhere, despite having nowhere in particular to be. You fall constantly into mud, into baskets, into sheep. But each tumble is met not with tears, but with a grunt of confusion, a flick of snot, and a clumsy push back to standing. Because in this place, in this world, there is no special fuss made over the misadventures of toddlers. Pain is part of the curriculum. Dirt is part of the diet. And pride, that great enemy of childhood, is a luxury reserved for people who don't regularly fall asleep with fish scales stuck to their cheeks. Your mother, who now rarely carries you except when your feet freeze or your tantrum hits operatic levels, watches you with a mixture of weariness and quiet admiration. She points things out with simple words: net, axe, fish, fire, and you parrot them back in garbled syllables, mispronounced but enthusiastic, earning the occasional chuckle from your older siblings, who, it must be said, seem to regard you as a sort of living pet project. Half annoyance, half mascot. Entirely part of the furniture now. They teach you how to throw pebbles into puddles, how to shout at seagulls, you're very good at this, and how to chew on dried kelp without looking like you're trying to eat rope. All valuable skills in their own way. You begin to recognize faces beyond the blur of mother, father, sibling. The village is small, but each person wears a story in their wrinkles, in the way they walk, in how they haul rope or sharpen blades or carry baskets. There's the one-eyed man who once sailed to the land of the green cliffs and came back with a broken leg and a wife who never speaks above a whisper. There's the woman with hands like tree roots, who bakes bread so dense it could be used as a weapon. There's the boy with a crooked smile who always shares his smoked herring, but only after licking it first, because brothers are like that. Mainstream fact: Viking settlements along coastal fjords were often tightly knit, and children were raised communally to some degree, meaning you are scolded not just by your mother, but by half the village, and praised, too, when you manage not to fall into the well or eat something profoundly inedible. The idea of, "that's not my child," doesn't really exist here. Everyone is everyone's business, for better or worse, which means your earliest attempts at independence are both cheerfully celebrated and thoroughly monitored. And as for chores, yes, even now, even this early, there are things you are expected to do, or at least attempt. You are handed a small basket and asked to carry firewood. You drag it through the dirt and proudly deliver 3 twigs and a pine cone. You are told to shoo the chickens into their coop. You do this by yelling, "Go!" and flailing your arms like a tiny berserker, which terrifies the chickens, delights your siblings, and mildly annoys your father. But you are participating, which is what matters. You are being folded into the rhythm of things, the slow daily loop of eat, work, eat again, sleep, rise, repeat. There is a comfort in this loop, a simplicity that does not ask you to dream grand dreams yet, only to stay upright, stay warm, and stay fed. Your days begin to lengthen, not just because the sun is returning to the sky's higher throne, staying out later with each passing week, but because your own attention stretches with it. You start to notice things beyond your immediate bubble. The way your father's hands move when he knots a net. The way your mother hums while she stirs a pot. The way the sea changes color depending on whether it's thinking kind thoughts or cruel ones. You begin to ask questions too. Endless, repetitive questions that require infinite patience to answer. Why becomes your favorite word, followed closely by mine and fish, each spoken with wide-eyed insistence and often no context whatsoever. Quirky fact: there's a belief among some of the older villagers that children like you can see spirits until their 4th winter, that the line between this world and the next is thinner for you, like frost on glass, and that your laughter might be echoes of voices no one else can hear. Your grandmother, when she visits, usually with a smoked sausage tucked into her belt and a sharp word for anyone who's let the stew go too thin, tells you stories about creatures in the woods, spirits in the water, and stars that wink out if you point at them. You believe all of it, not because it's logical, but because she says it with such certainty that you'd be a fool not to. You begin to explore more now, leaving the doorway, then the yard, then the edge of the village under careful watch. The world feels immense. Rocks become mountains. Creeks become roaring rivers. Sticks become swords or fishing poles, or the backs of sea serpents depending on the day and your mood. You invent games that make no sense to anyone but you. Speak to birds like old friends, and practice climbing everything climbable, even things that clearly do not want to be climbed, like your father's back when he's trying to gut a particularly stubborn haddock. The sea remains the background music to your every action. It is always there, always present, always singing its strange, salty lullaby. You grow used to its moods, to the way it shifts from calm glass to roaring beast without much warning, to the way it sometimes brings things in, logs, dead fish, the occasional bit of drifted rope, and sometimes takes things away. Buckets, sandals, fish hooks, even once. A small wooden horse you had just decided was your favorite toy. You cried, of course. Then you found a crab shell and decided it was better anyway. You begin to eat more of what the family eats now. Porridge thickened with fish scraps, bread crusts dipped in broth, the occasional berry when the season is kind. You're still more of a mess maker than a meal finisher, but your fingers grow stronger, more nimble, more capable of wielding a wooden spoon like a tiny, clumsy warrior. And when the stew is hot and the fire is low, and your siblings are already asleep in a pile of limbs and blankets, You sometimes get a bit of something special, a fatty piece of smoked eel, a dollop of honey if there's any to spare, a chunk of dried apple rehydrated in cider. And for a moment, the world feels perfect. The air is changing now, warming in ways you don't have words for yet, but can feel in your bones. The sun lingers. The ground softens. The boatwork intensifies. And as your steps grow steadier and your curiosity expands past the perimeter of your known universe, you find yourself drawn more and more to the dock, to the boats, to the stories whispered by the men and women who return from the water smelling of salt and wind and adventure. You begin to understand that this is what waits for you, not in years, but in seasons, in small turns of the sun. The boat is your future, the sea your school, the cod your curriculum, and soon, very soon, they will begin to teach you how to sail. It happens slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, the way a tree's roots creep outward beneath the soil without anyone noticing, until one day they crack the stone beneath the path. Your world, once so tightly bound to the longhouse and the safe perimeter of its walls, begins to expand, and with it, your expectations shift. Your eyes sharpen, and your sense of self, still soft and pliable like bread left to rise near the fire, starts to harden into something with angles and opinions, especially about fish, mud, and the unfair distribution of roasted turnips. You are no longer just the little one underfoot, no longer merely a spectator in the daily performance of survival. You are a small but increasingly vocal participant, staking your claim over the corner of a bench, a favored walking stick, and, occasionally, a particularly nice rock that you insist is yours, despite repeated evidence to the contrary. And while the rest of the world might still regard you as a child, dirty-faced, gap-toothed, perpetually sticky with things no one can identify, you, in your own mind, are now a proper crew member in the great vessel of village life. You wake with the first light, or at least shortly after your mother's feet begin to creak across the floorboards. You dress yourself, more or less, often with tunic backward and one sock suspiciously missing. And you march outside with the solemn determination of someone who has important things to do, even if that mostly involves poking at puddles with a stick and attempting to trade a smooth pebble for a scrap of jerky. This is the season of apprenticeship, not in the formal sense of being bound to a craftsperson with a handshake and a goat, but in the subtler, more pervasive sense of simply watching everything older hands do and mimicking it with varying levels of success. You trail after your father when he walks to the shore, mimicking his stoop, his squint, even the way he spits into the wind to test the air. Although your version is more dribble than declaration. You watch your mother thread wool with the same patience she threads dried fish on a cord, and you attempt to twist strings together into something vaguely useful, usually ending up with a knotted mess that looks like a sea creature gave up halfway through evolving. Mainstream fact: Viking children were often expected to begin helping with work as soon as they were physically able, meaning by the time you're 5 or 6, you're already learning to carry water, gut small fish, and feed the chickens without being pecked into submission. Your fingers are learning the difference between soft moss and tough hide, between the grain of wood that splits easily and the stubborn kind that makes spoons out of spite. Your feet, still a little too eager to find every thorn and sharp shell, begin to toughen. Your back learns to carry a small basket of fish without tipping it over, You're not good at any of it yet, but you're also not entirely terrible anymore, which is a kind of progress. You are rewarded for effort, not excellence. When you manage to clean a fish without accidentally flinging its eye across the room, someone pats your head. When you remember to feed the dog before it starts whining, your mother gives you an extra corner of bread. When you fall into the barrel while trying to retrieve a dropped ladle, someone pulls you out, laughs until they cry, and then hands you a dry tunic with a wink. There is love here, not soft, coddling love, but the kind that makes sure you're fed, warm, and have just enough rope to test your own strength without hanging yourself with it. You spend more time outside now, even when the sky hangs low and the clouds threaten to spit hail the size of marbles. The sea, which once seemed distant and unknowable, is now an old acquaintance. Temperamental, yes, but not unfriendly. You learn to recognize the different voices it uses. The gentle lap of low tide, the angry slap of a sudden gust, the whisper it makes in the early morning when no one else is watching. You start to notice that fish behave differently depending on the hour, the tide, the color of the water. You can't explain it yet, but you feel it in your bones. That strange, ancient rhythm that all coastal people seem to inherit like a birthright or a curse. Quirky fact: some Viking fishermen believed certain species of fish could only be caught if you spoke kindly to them, or in some cases, insulted them just right. There's an old man in your village who swears he once tricked a particularly large cod into leaping into his boat by reciting a very rude poem about its mother. He's not entirely trusted, but he's often listened to, which is close enough. Your father begins to take you with him more frequently now. Not on the proper fishing expeditions, not yet, but on the short, safe journeys down to the shallows, where the nets are checked and the boats are patched, and the air smells less like fear and more like algae and rope. He doesn't talk much during these outings, but you learn from his silences, from the way he watches the horizon while he works, from the way he tests a knot's strength by leaning his whole weight into it. You imitate him, of course, pulling at ropes and pretending to frown with great seriousness, even though the only thing you're actually tying is your own shoelaces together. Your reward for this effort? Sometimes a small smoked fish, handed to you without a word, but with a nod that feels like a medal. Sometimes just the knowledge that he trusts you to walk beside him and not fall into the sea. That trust is more nourishing than anything you eat. Evenings bring warmth, food, and a kind of chaos that somehow manages to feel comforting. You eat with your family at the long bench, your legs still swinging above the floor, your hands often sticky with broth or honey. You listen more than you talk, absorbing tales of weather, catches, rival villages, strange dreams, and ghost stories repeated so often they feel like lullabies. You learn that life here is not just about survival. It's about rhythm, about knowing when to work, when to rest, when to speak, and when to simply sit beside someone and let the fire do the talking. You begin to dream more vividly too. Dreams of boats and whales and flying over the fjord with wings made of fish bone and seaweed. You wake sometimes with sand in your mouth and the vague certainty that you've just fought a sea dragon and won. Your grandmother says it's the spirits again, visiting your sleep to teach you things you can't yet learn while awake. You believe her, naturally. She's never steered you wrong, except for that time she told you seagull droppings were good luck, and you spent the whole morning trying to get pooped on. Still, intentions count for something. Spring edges towards summer, and your tunic grows shorter not because you've outgrown it, though you have, but because someone cut off the ragged hem rather than sew a new one. Your arms and legs are brown now, streaked with dirt that doesn't wash off entirely, and your hair has begun to tangle into its own wild landscape. You look like a small bear cub with an axe to grind, and you love it. You are faster, louder, bolder. You challenge your siblings to races you rarely win, splash in tide pools with the intensity of someone convinced the next big discovery is hiding just under a rock, and declare war on a cluster of seaweed that looks vaguely threatening. And amid all this chaos, there are moments, brief, quiet, nearly invisible, where you stop just for a second to listen. To the sea sighing, to the gulls crying, to the creak of boats and the murmurs of tired voices, to the world that is slowly, gently teaching you how to belong to it. You do not yet know the weight of the name you carry, or the future that waits just beyond the next storm, or the joy and sorrow wound into the same net you'll one day cast yourself. But you do know this. You are growing, you are learning, and the world, for now, is still more wonder than worry. By the time the sun finally begins to linger in the sky well into the night, stretching its golden limbs across the fjord as if reluctant to go to sleep, you've reached an age where your tasks start to resemble real work. Not the charming attempts of a fumbling child, but genuine contributions that, if done poorly, might earn you a light scolding, and if done well, might spare someone else an aching back or a second trip to the shoreline. And this shift, subtle though it is, marks a turning point in your sense of self. A point at which you no longer feel like a guest in your own family's routine, but rather a functioning cog in the greater machine of your home, your boat, and your village, all of which seem, despite their stubbornness and strange logic, to somehow be rooting for you. Your mornings begin before you want them to, before the birds even, before the dew has been burned off the grass, and before your body has truly decided to cooperate with the idea of waking. You are shaken gently by your older brother, or nudged with a calloused foot by your father, depending on who rises first and who remembers that you are supposed to be learning what it means to fish, not just in play, but in practice. You dress in silence, still bleary-eyed, pulling on a tunic that smells faintly of smoke and salt, and you step outside into air that is brisk, sharp, and honest in a way that no bed ever is. Today, you will be joining your father and one of your uncles for the early catch. Not the long expeditions out to deeper waters, but the net hauls close to shore, where the fish are abundant, if less grand, and the labor is heavy, if not as perilous. You feel both honored and apprehensive. Honored because this means they trust your hands, at least a little. Apprehensive because your arms still wobble under the weight of a wet net, and your balance is not exactly the envy of the village. Still, there is pride swelling quietly in your chest as you step into the boat, clutching a small coil of rope as though it's a sword, and you're a warrior heading to battle. Not against men, but against tides, tangles, and the ever-fickle whims of the sea. Mainstream fact: Viking fishing boats, typically known as fairings or small rowing boats, were agile and ideal for inshore fishing. They were often manned by 2 to 4 people, and while they weren't built for the grandeur of open sea raiding, they were absolutely essential for everyday life. supplying villages with cod, herring, and flatfish, depending on the season and the currents. And here you are, gripping the worn wooden edge of one such vessel, trying to look more confident than you feel. The water is calm this morning, a mercy that even the adults seem to silently acknowledge. The sky above is pale blue with streaks of rose, like someone smudged the sunrise with their thumb. And the only sounds are the rhythmic splash of oars and the occasional creak of the boat, as if it's muttering under its breath about being woken up so early. You are handed the net, light and dry for now, and shown how to release it gently, letting it sink in coils, not clumps, and how to watch for the subtle tug that signals a fish has been caught, and not just annoyed. You struggle, of course. The net folds where it shouldn't, and your arms don't quite coordinate the release smoothly. But your father corrects you with quiet words and strong hands, guiding yours until they learn to follow instinct rather than fear. Your uncle, less patient but not unkind, tells you stories to pass the time. About fish so big they snap the boat in two. About whirlpools that open only when the moon is full. And about seals that steal nets for reasons known only to them. You believe some of it, or at least pretend to, because his voice is as much part of the morning as the waves, and something about the way he talks makes the fish seem like characters in a saga rather than mere food. When the net finally comes up full, flashing with silver bodies, squirming, gasping, utterly unbothered by your philosophical thoughts, you are surprised by the violence of it. Not the blood, which is minimal, but the sheer motion, the thrashing and slapping of tails. The way the fish fight even as they're caught, as if they know their fate and still refuse it. You hesitate, unsure how to help, but your father nudges you forward, and soon your fingers are slick with fish slime. Your arms sore from hauling. Your tunic damp and sticky in ways that will take hours to forget. And yet you are grinning, because for the first time, you feel like a real fisherman, not just a boy in a boat. Quirky fact: some Viking fishermen believed that singing certain chants while casting nets would bring better luck, particularly if sung in the direction of the rising sun. Your uncle, always one to test fate, hums a tune under his breath, tuneless and raspy but strangely hypnotic. And when you ask what it means, he tells you it's a spell for good catch and strong arms, though he won't say whether it's meant for the fish or for you. The catch is hauled back to shore, sorted with practiced hands into baskets lined with reeds. You help carry one, staggering under the weight, feeling the basket press into your hip bone and the handles bite into your fingers. But you do not drop it, not even when the dog runs up barking and nearly trips you. Your mother meets you at the threshold of the longhouse, her face unreadable for a moment, and then she nods once, just once, and takes the basket from your hands. You feel taller than before, even if your back aches. Later, while the fish are being cleaned and dried, you sit beside the fire, exhausted but buzzing, replaying the morning in your head, like a story you don't want to end. Your siblings ask questions. How many fish? How big? Did you see a seal? Did you fall in? And you answer them all with the authority of someone who now knows the difference between the weight of a net and the weight of a story. That night, you sleep harder than you ever have. The kind of sleep that only comes when the body is worn out and the spirit is satisfied. You dream of waves and fish, of boats and firelight. And in the morning, before anyone wakes you, you wake yourself eager to do it all again, because this is who you are now. Not just a boy in a village, but a boy with sea salt in his veins, with calluses forming where there were none, and with eyes that have started to recognize the difference between calm water and deceitful stillness. You are still learning, yes, but the sea is no longer a stranger. It is your teacher, your mirror, and, though you don't yet have the words for it, your oldest and most complicated friend. The days stretch into one another, like a net unspooling endlessly across the tide. A rhythm so steady, so deeply etched into your bones, that even the change in sky and shift in winds seem to echo the steady hum of your village life, where the clink of metal against wood, the flap of drying sails, and the distant bleats of restless goats make up the background music to your now familiar mornings, afternoons, and evenings, all stitched together by that thin, briny thread of seawater that touches everything: your skin, your food, your dreams, and even the way you think. Your responsibilities continue to grow, not in leaps, but in quiet, creeping increments. The kind you don't notice until you're suddenly the one trusted to pack the salted fish in layers of moss and snow, or to paddle the small boat around the inlet with only a cousin who still thinks fish come from the gods as company. And though you're not yet given the honor of deciding where the nets will be cast or when to sail home, your opinion is occasionally asked. Once, even by your father, and the sensation of being listened to, of being not just heard, but considered, makes your chest swell so large you worry it might lift you off the ground. You are also taller now, or at least tall enough that your tunics no longer hide your wrists, and your legs have begun to take on the sturdier shape of someone who spends more time standing than sitting, though your knees still bear the occasional scrape from climbing rocks too eagerly or chasing chickens with more confidence than caution. Your voice, once a high, giggling thing that echoed like a bird through the longhouse rafters, has begun to dip and waver into something uncertain. A voice trying on the shape of a man, but not quite filling it yet, like a puppy barking at shadows too large to understand. Mainstream fact: in Viking coastal villages, adolescent boys were often expected to accompany their elders on longer fishing expeditions, or assist with trade and supply runs to neighboring settlements, both by land and by boat, marking their transition into functional members of the economic life of the community. And so it happens one day, perhaps not entirely by surprise, but still with a thump in your chest, that you are told to pack your gear, prepare your satchel, and join your father and a few others on a 3-day journey up the coast to trade fish and cloth for timber, iron nails, and that elusive marvel everyone keeps whispering about: good beeswax. You rise before dawn, heart fluttering like a trapped bird in your chest, packing your small roll of belongings: a spare tunic, a water skin, 2 pieces of dried bread, and a tiny bone carving your sister gave you for luck, though you suspect she just wanted an excuse to hand you something. The boat you board is not your usual fairing, but a longer vessel, deeper of hull and fitted for both rowing and sail, already creaking with the weight of barrels, bundles, and bodies, all bristling with anticipation. You take your seat among the younger rowers, muscles tense, hands fidgeting with the handle of your oar as the older men exchange stories and jokes in the gruff, familiar tones of people who've done this many times and expect to do it many more. You are quiet, not because you're shy, but because everything feels bigger than you. The boat, the water, the expectation. And as the sail is raised and the wind catches with a triumphant snap, you realize this is the furthest you've ever gone from home. The longest you will have ever gone without your mother's voice, or your sister's teasing, or the safety of your own wooden stool beside the hearth. But there is also exhilaration, a current that runs deeper than fear, pulling you forward. The coastline slips by slowly, a procession of cliffs, forests, and lonely beaches scattered with driftwood and gulls. Each bend of land unfamiliar, yet somehow comforting. Like the edge of a map that's been hinted at in bedtime stories, but never traced with your own eyes. You learn quickly that rowing is not merely about strength, but about rhythm. About timing your stroke to the roll of the boat and the shift of the waves. And when your arms begin to ache and your blisters start to sing, no one laughs. Someone simply hands you a strip of cloth, and the rhythm continues. Midway through the journey, the boat makes camp on a rocky inlet ringed by pine trees and sharp-smelling herbs. You help unload supplies, gather driftwood, and, to your immense pride, manage to light a fire with only 2 tries. A feat that earns you a nod from a grizzled man with a face like dried bark and a single tooth who mumbles, "Good lad." And that's somehow better than a song. Quirky fact: Vikings sometimes carried with them small talismans carved from bone, antler, or wood, believing these tokens could ward off bad weather or clumsy hands. And your own little carving, supposedly shaped like a fish but looking more like a duck with a headache, becomes a kind of companion. One you rub between your fingers when the wind howls a bit louder or the boat rocks just a little too hard. When you finally arrive at the trading settlement, a cluster of longhouses wrapped in smoke and noise, your senses are overwhelmed. The smells of unfamiliar meats and boiled roots, the loud barter of strangers speaking a dialect you understand but don't quite trust, the glittering metal tools laid out on blankets, and the sight of horses, actual horses, not the shaggy ponies you sometimes see hauling carts at home, moving with a grace you didn't think legs that long could manage. You trail after your father, eyes wide, hands clenched around your satchel, trying not to stare too openly at the blacksmith, who seems to have more hair on his arms than you have on your head. Your father doesn't introduce you to anyone. He doesn't need to. You are expected to observe, to learn, to carry what needs carrying, to count how many fish are exchanged for how many sacks of salt, and to know that listening is more valuable than speaking. You do this with the quiet diligence of someone who understands that everything here, every word, every glance, every smell, is a kind of lesson you may need later. You sleep that night inside a borrowed longhouse on a pile of woven reeds that smells like mushrooms and old sweat, your legs still swaying from the phantom motion of the boat. You dream, as you often do these days, of fish with human eyes, of birds who speak riddles, and of a woman with silver hair who gives you a knife carved from ice. You wake with your mouth dry and your heart beating far too fast, but the feeling passes, replaced by hunger and the scratch of your father's voice telling you it's time to load the boat again. The journey home is quieter, the laughter muted, the wind colder, and the food nearly gone. You row with less chatter and more focus, your blisters now hardened into proper calluses, your mind preoccupied with the weight of what you've seen. And when the familiar curve of your own shore finally appears on the horizon, the village rising from the earth like an old friend. You feel two things at once: the deep relief of returning and the strange, private knowledge that something inside you has shifted, expanded, grown roots. You are not quite a man. Not yet. But you are no longer just a boy either. You are something in between. A traveler returning home, a helper becoming a craftsman, a child learning how to carry the sea in his chest without letting it drown his heart. The return home, though comforting in its familiarity, does not wrap you in the same soft woolen certainty it once did, because now the longhouse feels a little smaller, the hearth a little dimmer, the chatter around you not quite as consuming as before, and you, who once nestled easily into the corners of the world your family carved from salt and smoke, now find yourself sitting straighter, listening closer, speaking less, but thinking more, as if your mind has grown legs longer than your body and has begun to wander places your feet have not yet dared to tread. You resume your daily routines, of course. No one gets to graduate from chores just because they went on a trading trip and saw a man with a golden ring in his nose. But there's a new tone to how you're treated. Not with reverence or even much outward acknowledgement, but with small gestures. The way your brother now asks for your opinion on knotting the nets. The way your uncle tosses you the better knife when it's time to clean fish. Or the way your mother leaves the hearth to you when she steps outside to fetch herbs, trusting you not to let the fire die. It's in the small things, really, that the world shifts around you, slowly enough that if you weren't paying attention, you might miss it. Like the way frost thickens on the grass day by day until suddenly, the fields are white, and the breath of every villager appears in the air like a whispered secret. Mainstream fact: in Norse communities, as boys approached their teenage years, they were often trained not only in the arts of fishing and farming, but also in the storytelling and oral traditions that preserved family histories and myths. And so, as winter draws closer and the sea becomes a more reluctant partner, heaving with ice floes, sighing with the kind of wind that wants to pick your bones clean, you spend more time indoors, curled beside fires, not always working, sometimes simply listening as the elders recount tales of old voyages, sea serpents that swallowed ships whole, gods who fished with hooks the size of harpoons, and the icy domains where the dead sail forever in longboats made of shadow. One such tale, told by your father in his low, steady voice while sharpening a blade on his knee, sticks with you more than the others. It's about a fisherman who, upon catching a fish that spoke his name, was cursed to dream the dreams of every creature he had ever netted, and was eventually driven to live beneath the waves, his eyes glowing blue like drowned stars. You laugh along with the others, of course, because it's a story, just a story. But that night, you lie awake staring at the rafters, wondering what a fish might dream about, and whether your dreams already smell of seawater. Your education, such as it is, begins to deepen in more practical ways too. You're taught to repair sails using sinew and patience, to read the shape of clouds and the curl of gull wings for weather signs, to know the difference between a hungry wind and a lazy one, and to mark the way seaweed clusters change their color by season. You're taught how to scrape barnacles from hulls without splitting the wood, how to bait traps so that crabs won't just steal and scuttle, and even how to gut a seal, though you do it with more squeamishness than pride and secretly apologize to its glassy eyes before anyone notices. Quirky fact: Some Viking fishermen believed that whistling while rowing attracted the attention of sea spirits or nukken, the shape-shifting water beings said to lurk in lakes and fjords. And so, of course, your brother makes it his personal mission to whistle constantly, especially on foggy mornings, just to see if the nukken will show up and drag him off, though the most he ever manages is to summon a particularly angry swan. The longhouse becomes a kind of womb again, but this time not for birth, but for a strange sort of rebirth. You spend your evenings practicing knots with your sister, whose nimble fingers always seem to finish a pattern just before yours. And she teaches you how to braid cords so tightly they could tow a horse. Your mother lets you assist her in curing fish skins for mittens. And though the smell is somewhere between unforgettable and unbearable, you find it oddly satisfying to see something so slimy become something so warm. Even your grandfather, old and mostly silent now, lets you carry his walking staff and, once, tells you that he dreamed of a whale that spoke in riddles. And you wonder, only half joking, if maybe he's the fisherman from the cursed story. Winter tightens its grip, wrapping the village in layers of gray sky and snow that crunches underfoot like bones in the woods. And you discover that fishing does not stop when the water freezes. It merely changes shape. Now you rise before dawn to trek across brittle ice, chisel in hand, to open holes wide enough for nets, careful not to make them too round, lest the spirits mistake them for mouths and try to climb through. You learn to judge the thickness of the ice by sound, a low hum meaning safety, a hollow clack meaning run. It's exhausting, this life, this unending dance with the sea, but it's also grounding, the kind of routine that doesn't give you much time to question whether you enjoy it, because by the time you remember to ask, your hands are already wrist-deep in freezing water, and your answer doesn't matter anyway. You sleep harder, dream louder, and wake with the kind of hunger that can only be satisfied by hot fish stew and the knowledge that your body is slowly becoming something capable, reliable, and stubbornly your own. One day, while dragging a net across a shallow inlet crusted with broken ice, you feel a tug unlike the usual fluttering resistance of fish. A weight that doesn't writhe but simply pulls, firm and unyielding. You shout for your cousin, who helps haul the net, and together you pull up something neither of you expects. An old wooden box, bound with rusted iron bands, its lid cracked just enough to reveal a few glinting objects, beads maybe, or teeth. Your cousin swears it's cursed, drops it, and runs. But you keep staring at it, not because you want to open it, but because part of you feels like it was waiting for you. You kick snow over it, mark the spot with a stick, and say nothing. You carry that silence for days, tucked in your chest, like a stone under your tongue, not sure whether it was treasure, omen, or simply trash. But every time you pass that inlet, you walk slower, and you wonder if the fisherman with the glowing eyes had a box too. Still, you don't dwell too long. There is always something to do, always another fire to tend, net to repair, woodpile to restock, or goat to chase back into the pen. The days blur, as they always do, but now they carry with them a sense of direction, a faint pull like a current you can't see but can feel. And you begin to understand that you're not just being raised, you're being shaped, slowly and thoroughly, like a ship hull bent over flame and time. And in that shaping, you feel the beginnings of something you can't name, something like pride, but deeper. Something like belonging, but more restless. Whatever it is, it tastes like salt and wood smoke. By the time the frost begins to recede from the grass, as if the earth itself is finally exhaling after months of holding its icy breath. You have grown so used to the rhythm of the cold season that its departure feels both a relief and a disturbance. Like a beloved but demanding guest who finally packs up and leaves. And though you're glad to have the hearth to yourself again, a strange quiet settles in the absence of its heavy boots. You begin to rise earlier, not because you're told to, but because your body has learned to anticipate the slow, golden shift of light through the longhouse slats. And even when you lie in bed a few extra moments, stretching your arms above your head and listening to the crows mutter at each other in the trees outside, your thoughts are already listing the day's tasks in order of what will freeze your fingers the least. And it is during one such early morning, while stepping into the cold, wet yard to fetch a pile of sticks for the morning fire, that your mother pulls you aside. Not with urgency, but with that casual sort of seriousness that lets you know something important is coming, and hands you a small cloth pouch tied with twine. You open it to find 3 hooks, gleaming and barbed, unlike the duller ones you've been practicing with. And your eyes widen a little because these are not hooks for children or for practice. They are serious tools for serious fishing, sharp enough to catch more than just fish, dangerous in the right or wrong hands. She doesn't say much, just nods and tells you to clean them well after every use. And for the rest of the day, as you walk down to the water or sort through nets, or even chew through a particularly tough heel of bread, you find yourself glancing toward your belt pouch where the hooks now rest like little secrets, aware in a new way of the responsibility that accompanies even the smallest bit of iron. Mainstream fact. In Viking society, the passing down of tools from parent to child was often a deeply symbolic act, marking a rite of passage from dependence to contribution. And the moment you receive your first proper fishing hook is not just about catching bigger cod. It's about the trust it represents. The quiet, unspoken admission that you are now someone who can be counted on. From that day on, your relationship with the sea shifts slightly. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that you begin to notice things you hadn't before. You begin to read the surface of the water the way others read carved runes, recognizing the subtle warning of a shift in tide. The swirl of foam that means a school of herring has passed below. The way the gulls cry differently when following a pod of seals. You begin to think not only like a fisherman, but like something closer to the sea itself, patient, observant, and quietly calculating. One afternoon, while out with your uncle and 2 of the neighbor boys, all packed tight into a weathered fairing that creaks when it breathes and stinks of smoked fish and old oil, you get your chance to use one of your hooks for the first time. You bait it with a sliver of pickled mackerel. Cast your line with the slow, cautious movements you've practiced 100 times in shallower waters. And wait, letting the rhythm of the waves lull your mind into that half-dreaming state fishermen know well. And when the tug comes, sudden, strong, definite, you nearly lose the rod over the side in your surprise. But your grip holds, your breath catches, and with trembling arms and no small amount of shouting from your companions, you haul up a silver-backed beauty nearly the size of your forearm. There is cheering, clapping, even a joke about whether you enchanted the fish with your terrifying singing voice. And you sit there, wind in your hair, fish in your lap, cheeks flushed not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something proud and old and rooted in the sea, that makes you understand why your father smiles so little but so deeply after a good catch. Quirky fact: it was not uncommon for Viking fishermen to name particularly large or memorable fish before gutting them, sometimes offering a short eulogy or joke to honor their size or supposed cunning. And so naturally, you name your fish Old Sneaker, after the time your cousin lost his boot in the mud and blamed a sea monster, and the name sticks, especially when you proudly recite it at dinner, even as your sister nearly chokes from laughter. The fish is cooked and shared that night, and although it tastes no different from any other properly grilled catch, everyone claims it does, just to flatter you. And your father, after scraping the last flakes of meat from the spine, claps a hand on your shoulder so firmly it nearly knocks the stew from your bowl. You grin through the ache. After that, your outings grow more frequent, your catches more consistent, and slowly you start to find yourself entrusted with tasks that once seemed far beyond your reach. Manning the tiller while the others nap, haggling with a trader from the neighboring fjord over the price of dried kelp, even correcting your cousin when he knots the net wrong, which earns you a dirty look followed by a grudging thanks 2 hours later when the net doesn't unravel like last time. You even begin to carve your own hooks, carefully filing down slivers of antler and horn, testing their bite against scraps of leather, learning which shapes snag best and which bend too easily. You lose a few, of course, one to a particularly clever eel, another to your own clumsy fingers. But each failure teaches more than it takes, and soon your little pouch of tools includes not just hooks, but small weights, bits of twine, and even a shell polished smooth enough to reflect your own face, sunburned and wind-chapped and grinning like a fool. By the time summer rolls in and the sky stretches into late twilight before letting go, you are no longer treated like an extra pair of hands, but like a proper member of the crew. You are asked, consulted, even argued with. And though you lose most of those arguments, the fact that they happen at all is a badge of honor you wear just beneath your collarbone. One evening, returning home after a particularly long haul, your arms aching and your back singing the praises of firmer bedding, you find your mother sitting outside the longhouse with your youngest sister asleep on her lap, and your grandfather quietly humming to himself as he carves a bird from driftwood. The air is soft, filled with the scent of wood smoke and wet moss, and as you settle beside them, the only sound for a while is the distant murmur of waves and the quiet, contented wheezing of a baby dreaming dreams too simple for words. In that moment, you feel something rare and unexpected. Not pride, not excitement, not even relief, but peace. Pure, unbothered, deliciously boring peace. The kind that soaks into your bones like the heat from a well-tended fire and makes the world feel exactly the right size. Not too big, not too small, just right. And somewhere deep inside, you whisper a thank you to the sea, even if you know it won't hear you. You wake that morning with the weight of fishbone dreams clinging to your thoughts. The kind of dreams that don't make much sense in the light, but still manage to leave behind a salty aftertaste, as though your mind has been trawling the seabed all night, and surfaced only to find itself wrapped in seaweed and old, forgotten memories. The scent of wood smoke from the hearth drifts into your nose even before you open your eyes, and the muffled scrape of your father's footsteps over the packed dirt floor reminds you, without need for words, that the world has not paused during your sleep. You stretch, long and slow, every muscle waking up like an oar lifted from still waters, and as the cool air brushes against your cheeks, you realize it's the kind of day when the fog hangs low enough to kiss your eyebrows, and the seagulls sound like they're laughing at private jokes overhead. Today is not like other days, though it begins the same, with a bowl of porridge that insists on sticking to your teeth, with your brother elbowing you over who gets the better spoon, and your mother murmuring about needing more lichen for dye. But there's a hum in the longhouse, a kind of anticipation that vibrates beneath even the slowest chores. Word has come, quietly but insistently, that there will be a visit from a neighboring chieftain, one of those rare occasions when someone not from your village arrives by boat, wearing furs that haven't been patched 5 times and speaking in a rhythm just slightly off from your own, as if their words come from a land where the wind speaks a different dialect. Your village doesn't receive many visitors, and when it does, the arrival is treated almost like a storm at sea, respected, prepared for, and just a little feared. Everyone moves with a bit more haste. The huts are swept with actual brooms instead of birch branches. Children are reminded not to wipe their noses on their sleeves, and your father, normally so unconcerned with appearances, actually bothers to comb the knots out of his beard. You're not entirely sure what this chieftain wants, whether it's fish or gossip, an alliance or simply passage further north. But the fact that your father is putting on the tunic with the silver-threaded trim means it matters. You've only seen him wear that twice. Once when your grandfather died, and once when a boat of raiders mistook your harbor for theirs and had to be gently but firmly redirected before blood was shed. So, naturally, you volunteer yourself as an errand runner, pretending that you're simply being helpful, but really hoping to catch a glimpse of the visitor and maybe, just maybe, hear something worth telling your cousins later by the fire. Mainstream fact: Viking society placed great value on hospitality and the reception of guests, especially those of high status, often preparing elaborate meals and formal welcomes, not only to impress, but to demonstrate the host's strength, resources, and influence. By midday, the visitor arrives, not with a flourish or a band of armed guards, but in a simple longboat of dark wood, carved at the prow with the shape of a wolf's head, weather-worn but still fierce. The chieftain is older than you imagined, with deep-set eyes and a voice like bark rubbed on stone, and his cloak is trimmed with fox fur, dyed the color of dried blood. He speaks with your father for what feels like hours, their voices low, measured, occasionally interrupted by a burst of laughter or a grim nod that leaves you and everyone else squinting into your porridge, pretending not to eavesdrop. Eventually, as expected, a feast is called. Not a grand one, but more food than usual, and certainly more mead. You help prepare, carrying bundles of dried fish to the smokehouse, fetching herbs from the shed where your mother stores her fermented things, and slicing onions until your eyes water in a way that you'd prefer no one mistake for tears. When the meal is finally served, dried cod, pickled root vegetables, thick slabs of bread, and a surprisingly tender roast bird. You sit near the back, among the younger ones, where you can observe without being observed. It's during this feast, somewhere between the second cup of watered mead and the chieftain's story about wrestling a seal off a rock, that you begin to understand something about diplomacy, about how people say one thing while carefully hiding another beneath it, like fish under ice. Your father laughs at the right moments, nods at the right pauses, but his fingers never leave the hilt of his belt knife. And the chieftain, for all his jokes, never quite stops watching the door. Quirky fact: in some Norse communities, it was common for guests and hosts to engage in flyting, a ritual exchange of poetic insults, as a way of displaying wit, asserting dominance, and amusing the crowd. And sure enough, toward the end of the evening, your uncle and the chieftain launch into a surprisingly clever exchange about whose beard resembles what animal's behind, much to the roaring delight of everyone under 40. That night, you help your father carry extra firewood to the guest hut, and though he says little, he tousles your hair as he walks past, the kind of gesture he usually saves for moments when he's either very tired or very proud. You don't know which it is, but you smile anyway and watch as the stars begin to pierce through the thickening night sky, each one sharp as a fishhook, dangling stories just out of reach. In the days that follow, the chieftain's visit becomes the talk of the village. Not because he stayed long, he didn't. Nor because he brought treasures, he didn't. But because of what he left behind. A rumor that something is stirring further inland, that raiders from the east have begun moving again, not by sea this time, but across the rivers, carving paths through the forests like blades through skin. Your father doesn't speak of it openly, but he begins checking the nets more often, sharpening tools that haven't seen use in years, and sending you on longer scouting trips with your cousin, who now walks with a spear instead of a walking stick. You, meanwhile, begin to understand that being a fisherman does not exclude you from other roles. You may not carry a sword, not yet, and your shoulders may still lack the scars of serious battle. But your role in the village is expanding. Not because anyone says so, but because you feel it in your bones, in the way you are now asked to watch the coastline while others sleep, in how the elders include you in the circle when maps are drawn in the dirt and plans whispered over firelight. You still fish, of course. There is always fish to catch, and the sea does not pause for rumors. But now, when you cast your line or pull your net, your mind is not only on the weight of the catch, but on the shape of sails against the horizon, on the distant bark of dogs that might not be yours, on the shifting silence that sometimes settles over the fjord like a question not yet answered. And one evening, standing knee-deep in salt water, sun low behind your shoulders, you look out across the vast, glinting stretch of sea and realize that you are no longer just a boy with a hook. You are becoming something else entirely. Not a warrior, not yet. But not only a fisherman either. You are a watcher, a keeper, a beginning. The next few weeks unfold not in a blur, as one might expect in times of anticipation, but in a slow, deliberate march of days that feel both heavier and more meaningful than those that came before. Days in which every task, from gutting a fish to repairing a frayed net, carries a kind of weight that has less to do with the thing itself and more to do with what it might one day mean if the worst were to happen. You find yourself moving through routines that once felt mindless with a strange new sense of reverence. as though the act of preparing your gear or checking the lines is no longer just about fishing, but about readiness, about being capable, about not being the one person left behind when things begin to shift for real. Your village hums with tension, not loud or dramatic like a war drum, but quiet and persistent like the sound of a cracked oar just beginning to splinter. Subtle, but impossible to ignore once noticed. The elders speak in lower tones. Children are scolded more quickly. Your uncle begins wearing his axe strapped to his back even while drinking mead by the fire, and the blacksmith's forge stays lit longer into the evenings, its orange glow flickering through the mist like a tired eye that refuses to sleep. Still, the sea remains indifferent, its tides steady, its creatures unbothered by rumors of war or shifting alliances. And so you go on fishing, because what else is there to do? The cod don't care for politics. The nets don't mend themselves. And your family still needs food, laughter, and stories, perhaps now more than ever. But even as your fingers braid the fibers of a new net, or your feet guide the boat over familiar waters, your mind drifts toward possibilities, toward questions you're not quite ready to ask out loud, like whether you would be able to defend the ones you love, whether you would hesitate if the moment came, or whether fear might take you before any blade ever could. Mainstream fact: Viking men were typically trained from a young age not only in farming, fishing, and seafaring, but also in combat techniques, as the need to defend one's village was considered as vital as feeding it. And so physical readiness was seen as a basic requirement for adult life, not a specialized skill. You begin, almost without realizing it, to incorporate small acts of preparation into your days. You practice throwing stones with your offhand while waiting for traps to fill. You ask your cousin to show you how to hold a spear properly, just in case. And he laughs, but does it anyway, correcting your grip with a grunt and tossing you a slightly dulled training blade that used to belong to someone neither of you talks about anymore. You stash a second knife inside your boot and pretend not to notice when your mother starts carrying hers, tucked into the folds of her skirt, its hilt worn smooth by generations of hands that knew when the line between peace and necessity had grown too thin to see. One evening, after a long day repairing fish traps that a curious seal had joyfully destroyed, you find yourself alone at the edge of the woods that cradle the village like a shawl. The trees here are thick and familiar, not dangerous exactly, but easy to get lost in if you're not paying attention. You've been here many times before, gathering firewood, picking berries, tracking rabbits, but this time feels different. Not because the forest has changed, but because you have. You move more quietly, more deliberately, and when you hear the sudden snap of a twig behind you, you freeze, not in fear, but in focus. It turns out to be nothing more than a stray goat that's wandered too far from the pasture. But the moment stays with you, not for what happened, but for how ready you were when it did. Quirky fact: some Viking communities believed that animals, especially forest creatures like foxes and wolves, could be messengers from the gods or omens of events yet to come. And so even something as mundane as a goat behaving oddly might be interpreted as a sign, a warning, or at the very least, a good reason to pay more attention. That night, you dream of water again, but not the calm, glassy sea you know. This time it's churning, dark, almost alive. as if the ocean itself has teeth and eyes and a hunger that it barely conceals. You wake not in a sweat, but with a strange calm, like someone who's been warned and now knows what to watch for. There's no explanation for the feeling, and no one you'd know how to explain it to, but it sits with you the whole day. An invisible companion that walks 2 steps behind you wherever you go. Your father notices. He doesn't ask. Not directly, he never does. But when he invites you to accompany him on a fishing trip the next morning, just the 2 of you, no cousins, no uncles, no half-listening younger siblings, you understand it's not really about the fish. The sky is gray when you push off from the shore. A soft drizzle speckling the surface of the water like scattered seeds, and the air smells of brine and pine sap. The kind of sharp freshness that clears the throat whether you want it to or not. You don't talk much at first. Your father never rushes words. But after a while, once the lines are cast and the boat is drifting lazily with the tide, he asks you how long it's been since you last sharpened your knife. And when you tell him 2 weeks, he nods and says, "That's probably long enough." There's no lesson beyond that. No speech, no warning. Just a shared understanding that tools, like people, need tending, need readiness, need to be kept from rusting in the silence of inaction. The rest of the day passes with few words, but none are needed. You pull in 4 cod and a flatfish, and your father lets you steer the boat most of the way home, watching you with the quiet pride of someone who's not impressed by big moments, but by slow, steady competence. That evening, sitting around the fire, your sister tells a story about a girl who outwitted a troll by pretending to be one herself. And everyone laughs when she tries to mimic a troll voice, all gravel and growl, until the baby starts crying and the moment breaks into the usual warmth of bedtime rituals and soft, sleepy murmurs. You sit a little apart from the others, the way you sometimes do now, not because you feel distant, but because you are learning how to hold space for thoughts too large to share yet. Thoughts about loyalty and fear and what kind of man you are becoming without ever deciding to. You trace the edge of your boot knife absently as the fire dies down, and though the blade is duller than it should be, you don't draw the whetstone just yet. Some things can wait. Some things need to. And as you crawl beneath your fur blankets and feel the weight of sleep start to settle over your limbs like a thick fog over the fjord, you remember something your grandfather used to say. That strength isn't just in your arms or your blade, but in how you carry silence, how you weather uncertainty, and how you choose to act when no one is watching but the gods. The weather begins to shift in that subtle but insistent way it always does toward the tail end of the season. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself with storms or floods, but creeps slowly, like a blanket pulled over your shoulders just a bit too snug, until one morning you wake and realize that the air has changed, that the smell of the sea is sharper now, that the ground crunches slightly underfoot with frost that hadn't been there the day before, and that every person you pass in the village moves with the hunched, brisk efficiency of someone trying to keep warmth in and cold out, even if they won't yet admit that winter is coming. The days grow shorter, and with them, the tasks begin to adjust. Not fewer, just different. As everything starts to lean into preparation rather than production, into storing rather than catching, and your hands, once so occupied with pulling fish from the water, are now more often tangled in ropes that bind barrels of salted herring, or busy layering dried seaweed over root vegetables in the cool cellar beneath your uncle's longhouse, all in a communal choreography that's repeated year after year, generation after generation, each movement carrying the inherited wisdom of those who understood, long before you were born, that the sea does not provide endlessly, and the earth gives what it gives, but only if you treat it like a guest you wish to see again. Your own role in these routines becomes more central with each passing week. Not because anyone says it outright, but because you notice the way people start expecting you to remember things without being told twice. The way your younger cousin looks to your hands before attempting a task himself. And the way your mother now sends you alone into the woods to gather pitchwood and moss for kindling, trusting, without question, that you'll return before dark, and that you'll bring exactly what's needed without embellishment or excuse. Mainstream fact: Viking societies were deeply seasonal in their labor rhythms, with clear distinctions between summer activities like raiding, trading, and sea fishing, and winter tasks such as tool repair, storytelling, preserving food, and weaving, all of which were not only essential for survival, but also for maintaining a sense of structure and cultural continuity during the long, dark months. One morning, as you sit carving thin slivers from a block of dried whale blubber, a tedious but necessary task to ready the fuel for the lamps that will soon burn nearly around the clock, you overhear your father and another elder discussing a ship spotted far out in the bay, too distant to identify but close enough to raise cautious eyebrows. The other man says it's probably nothing, a passing merchant or a lost fisherman, but your father doesn't respond, just grunts softly and resumes sharpening the spine of his knife against a whetstone that already bears the scars of years of preparation. That night, he adds an extra log to the fire and keeps his boots near the door. You dream again, not of water this time, but of snow, endless and white and strange, falling from a sky that never ends. And in the dream, your hands are full of feathers, not tools, and your feet leave no prints behind you as you walk. You wake to find the edge of your blanket frozen stiff with condensation, and the small window near your sleeping nook rimed with frost that creeps in slow, delicate fingers, like a warning written in a language the land speaks only in whispers. The boatwork shifts indoors now. Long hours spent repairing hulls in the covered shed near the blacksmith's hut. Your breath misting in the cold air as you and the others hammer planks back into shape, seal gaps with tar thick as porridge, and scrape barnacles with the same enthusiasm you'd reserve for fleas. The conversation here is always a mix of practical nonsense and quiet speculation. Whether the fjord will freeze all the way this year, whether the goats will birth twins again, whether the Jarl to the south is still demanding tribute from the coastal villages, and whether, as your uncle jokes with only half a smile, you should be stockpiling not just fish, but favors. Quirky fact: to keep warm while working in freezing boat sheds, some Viking communities used heated stones, flat rocks placed in the fire, then wrapped in wool and tucked under clothing or into boots, creating crude but effective personal heating pads that sometimes left interesting scorch marks on undergarments, which later made for surprisingly entertaining stories around the hearth. Outside, children skate on the frozen puddles near the goat pens, laughing and shrieking in the crisp air as they chase each other in circles. Too young to understand the silent urgency that has begun to press into the hearts of their elders. who now walk the village paths, not just with firewood or fish baskets, but also with sharpened axes looped casually through their belts. You see it in the way people start looking over their shoulders more often, in the way the fires burn longer into the night, and in the way your mother starts waking before anyone else, standing outside the long house door with her shawl pulled tight around her, and her eyes fixed not on the ground, but on the horizon. You ask her once what she's looking for, and she just says, "movement," in a tone that makes you understand not to ask again. A week later, your cousin returns from a supply run to the neighboring settlement with news that's delivered not like a bombshell, but like a gust of cold wind, sudden, sharp, and impossible to ignore. The ship spotted earlier was not a merchant vessel, nor was it lost. It was scouting, sent by a rival clan known for pressing inland once the sea routes freeze over, for pushing into villages like yours when the nights are longest and the alarms are slowest. No battles yet, no official challenge, just a sighting, a shape in the fog, a pair of sails that don't belong. But that's all it takes to change everything. Your father calls a meeting that night. Not a war council, not yet, but something close enough to it that the air in the longhouse hums with a tension that thickens the smoke from the fire pit and makes even the dogs sit a little straighter. Plans are discussed. Routes are drawn in the dirt. You are told to prepare, but not to panic. To continue with your tasks, but to keep one eye always on the tree line. Your spear is checked and rechecked. Your knife is sharpened until it gleams like winter moonlight. And in your chest, something ancient and unfamiliar begins to stir. Not fear exactly, and not excitement, but a kind of watchful readiness, like a net held just above the water's surface, waiting for the slightest ripple. Later that week, the first snowfall comes, light and dry like ash, dusting the village in silence, softening the edges of everything until even the most menacing shadows seem temporarily hushed. Children build crude snow creatures near the well. Goats snort and huff at the cold. The wind bites through your tunic with a new sharpness that you know will soon become the norm. But beneath the quiet beauty of this fresh snow lies a certainty that this winter will not be like the ones before. There will be more to do than huddle and wait for spring. There will be tests, not just of strength, but of endurance, loyalty, and perhaps most of all, clarity of purpose. And so, on one particularly cold evening, as the northern lights ripple faintly across the sky like a god's half-forgotten yawn, you sit beside your father near the dying fire, both of you wrapped in layers of wool and fur, neither of you speaking, but both fully awake, fully aware, fully braced for the long winter ahead. As winter deepens its grip on your village with the slow and unrelenting patience of a god who doesn't care if you're ready, only that you endure, you begin to understand the season not as a frozen pause, but as an entirely different rhythm. One that doesn't roar with activity like summer's chaotic fishing voyages or the bustling preparation of autumn's harvests, but hums instead with the muffled thuds of chopping wood, the dull crackle of hearth fires, and the subtle choreography of survival that plays out day after day with no fanfare and no applause. Only the quiet satisfaction of breath drawn in a warm place while the wind shrieks just outside the door. You rise before the sun now, not because you have to, though tasks abound, but because something inside you has grown accustomed to the dark. And your body, ever more in tune with the demands of the world around you, has learned that comfort is fleeting and best taken early. That the quietest moments before the longhouse wakes are the most honest, the most intimate, the most yours. You tiptoe across the packed earth floor, wrap yourself in a fur that still smells faintly of the animal it once was, and step into the gray morning, where the frost clings to every beam, every rope, every twig, as if trying to hold the world together through sheer stubbornness. The snow outside is no longer a novelty. It's a blanket and a burden, both beautiful and brutal. And your footsteps crunch through it in a rhythm that feels like a heartbeat, steady and solemn, echoing your thoughts as you head toward the edge of the village to check the traps laid the day before. Simple snares and baited pits that your uncle taught you to set. Not because you are expected to catch anything extraordinary, but because every rabbit, every bird, every skinny squirrel matters now, and no mouth can afford to go unfed. Mainstream fact: in the Viking Age, winter trapping was a critical supplement to stored food supplies, with families using deadfall traps, pits, and baited snares to catch small game like ptarmigans, hares, and even the occasional fox. These animals provided not only meat, but also pelts for insulation and trade, their value rising significantly during the colder months when resources were stretched thin. You find 2 traps sprung, one empty, probably a clever creature that escaped with the bait, and the other holding a shivering hare, its soft eyes wide with fear, its breathing shallow but steady. You kneel beside it, offering a muttered apology under your breath, half out of habit, half out of a genuine flicker of regret, and dispatch it quickly, cleanly, the way your father showed you, the way that ensures you do not cause unnecessary pain, the way that separates a hunter from a butcher. You wrap the carcass in the cloth tied to your belt and head back, your footprints slowly vanishing behind you in the flurries that begin to fall again, fresh and cold and unbothered by the realities of your world. At the longhouse, your mother takes the hare without a word, her hands efficient and practiced, already setting water to boil for skinning and stewing, while your sister mends a pair of mittens by the fire, the wool so worn it practically begs for mercy. You sit beside her and warm your fingers, not just from the cold, but from the tension of the morning, and the flames lick at the edges of your thoughts until the silence feels like a balm rather than a burden. Later that day, a horn is blown, not the kind that signals danger, not the kind that calls for weapons or flight, but the long, low note that means a message has come. A visitor has arrived. Someone from another village braving the snow-laden trails to bring news, supplies, or occasionally, problems. This time, it is a man you recognize. Tall, wrapped in furs, face red with cold, and beard rimed with ice. He speaks with your father and the other elders near the central hearth, his words muffled by distance and the hiss of the fire. But you catch the important parts, the parts that matter. A raid on a village to the north, a band of warriors pressing inland from the coast, families displaced, stores taken, animals slaughtered. The message is simple: prepare. Quirky fact: Viking communities had intricate communication methods in winter, including relay messengers who traveled on skis, yes, skis, to deliver urgent news across the snowbound territories. While not every village had skilled skiers, Many relied on fast-footed messengers who memorized entire messages, often repeating them verbatim across multiple settlements, like icy-footed bards with very bad news. Your father doesn't react the way you expect, not with panic, not with defiance, but with a long, slow breath and a nod, as though he's been waiting for this moment to be confirmed. Preparations begin quietly that night, not frantic, not desperate, but deliberate. Weapons are sharpened, sentries are assigned, travel is discouraged, fires are kept burning longer and brighter, more for morale than warmth. You are not afraid exactly, but the air has changed again. Not in temperature, but in texture, as if it now carries the weight of something unseen pressing down upon it. In the days that follow, your tasks shift once more. You help reinforce the outer walls of the longhouse with snow-packed sod, insulating the cracks where the wind slips through like a whisper of misfortune. You practice throwing your spear into the trunk of the old tree near the burial cairn, counting your breath, adjusting for wind, learning how not to hesitate even when your arms ache from carrying water up the slope. You listen more than you speak now, especially when the elders talk. Not because you're afraid to speak, but because you've learned that wisdom rarely enters through the mouth. It tends to slip in through the ears, like smoke through a thatch roof. Each night, stories are told. Not new ones, but the old ones. The ones that remind you who you are, who you were, and who you might still become. Stories of sea kings and frost giants, of clever boys who outwitted spirits, and of brave girls who wrestled wolves into submission. Some are clearly myths, others have the ring of truth, but all are spoken in tones that make them feel like lullabies for the soul, comfort for the body, armor for the heart. One night, your grandmother, her back bent like the branch of a wind-beaten tree, her voice low and scratchy as dried rushes, tells a story you've never heard. One about a fisherman who once lived in a village like yours, who was born in the dead of winter, just like you, who grew to be strong and kind and quiet, and who once pulled a whale calf from the shallows with nothing but a rope and his own stubborn will. She looks at you when she finishes, not smiling, but with that glint in her eye that makes you wonder if she's telling a tale or speaking a prophecy you've yet to understand. And still, the snow falls. And still, you rise each morning. And still, you carry water, mend nets, chop wood, listen to the wind, and wait. For what, you're not sure. But you know deep down that whatever is coming, it will not catch you unready. Because now, you are a fisherman not just in name, but in spirit. Forged not only by salt water and sunlight, but also by ice, by silence, by the quiet pact you've made with the world to carry on no matter how long the night, no matter how bitter the cold. There comes a morning, cold as always, dim and rimmed in that bluish-gray tone that suggests even the sun is reluctant to get out of bed. When your routine, so solid, so anchored in hauling nets, mending ropes and watching the icicles drip from the eaves like slow, sharp tears, suddenly shifts, nudged gently but irrevocably off course by something you did not plan for and cannot ignore. A glance, a grin, a shared moment beside the fire pit while gutting herring, where fingers brush and eyes meet, and the world, still soaked in fish blood and soot and frost, tilts slightly on its axis as if to say, "Ah, there you are." As if to whisper, you weren't meant to be alone forever after all. The one who catches your eye, is not especially tall or imposing. Not the type who stands at the prow of a boat with the wind whipping through their hair like a saga hero from the old songs. But rather someone who works quietly, moves deliberately, laughs softly, and most importantly, doesn't flinch at the smell of your boots or the perpetual calluses on your hands, and who seems to find something endearing. No, not endearing, something steady in the way you coil rope, the way you talk to dogs as if they're fellow crew members, the way you mutter to yourself when patching the fish traps, as though your internal monologue is a second crewmate you keep on retainer. You're not entirely sure what to do with this feeling. It sits in your chest like a warm stone, unfamiliar but not unwelcome, glowing faintly even on the coldest days. So you do what you always do. You turn to work, to action, to the small rituals that have always grounded you. Except now they're tinged with a strange sense of anticipation, as if every trip down to the boat shed might result in a shared glance. Every fish gutting session might lead to another brush of fingers. Every run to the woodpile might include a shadow behind you, humming along with that strange tune you thought only you knew. Mainstream fact: Viking courtship was often surprisingly domestic, involving gift-giving, shared chores, and family negotiations more than dramatic declarations or poems shouted from rooftops. Relationships grew slowly, often beginning with helping hands at communal work or shared meals, and alliances were just as much about practicality as they were about affection. So it happens one morning, an errand run together to check the weir lines upstream, something that would normally be mind-numbingly ordinary, trudging along half-frozen paths, the wind making your eyes tear up, your breath fogging the air like a foghorn in miniature. But with them beside you, talking lightly about seals and seabirds and the taste of roasted parsnips, the hours stretch out like thread unwinding from a spool, not heavy or slow, but calm, deliberate, gentle in a way you hadn't expected. By the time you reach the river, the sun has managed to peek shyly through the cloud cover, casting everything in a pearly sheen that makes the snow sparkle and the icy river look like a ribbon of silver glass. And there, perched on a rock, smug and dripping, is an otter, chewing something too mangled to identify. And you both stop, not speaking, not moving, just watching the creature go about its business with utter indifference to your presence. And you realize, strangely but surely, that this moment, this stillness, this shared silence, this is the thing you'll remember later. Not the catch of the day, not the weather, not even what you talked about, but this, the two of you side by side, breathing together, part of the same quiet. Quirky fact: otters were considered lucky animals in Norse folklore. Playful, elusive, and clever, they were often associated with shape-shifting spirits or landvetter, land spirits. And to see one up close, especially during a journey, was seen by some as an omen of good fortune or unexpected union. When you return to the village, no one says anything. No one asks questions or raises eyebrows or nudges you with knowing grins. But a few people look up and nod. Not at you, not at them, but at the space between you, as if acknowledging that something invisible has taken root there. Something that might, given enough warmth and time and salted fish stew, grow into something that withstands winters far worse than this one. Over the next few weeks, life continues as it always does. Boats need repairing, seals need chasing off the docks, Old men need help up and down stairs they've climbed for decades. But the rhythm of your days now carries a new undertone, a low thrum of connection that threads through your hours like twine through a net, binding your tasks together with unexpected ease, as though the world has subtly rearranged itself to make room for something more than just survival. There's a quiet ceremony one evening, no loud declarations, no carved stones or shouting match between families, just a shared bowl of stew, a single silver ring, plain, hand-hammered, made by your cousin who still insists he should have been a blacksmith, and the exchange of cloaks before the hearth. And just like that, without fanfare or speeches, you are not alone anymore. Not in your hut, not on your fishing runs, not in your mind when you stare out across the frozen fjord and wonder what's next. You build a second bed, though it's more a pile of furs beside yours. And you find, curiously, that sleeping is easier now. Not because you're warmer, though you are. And not because the wind sounds different, though it does. But because the rhythm of another person breathing beside you is somehow the most reassuring sound you've ever known. More grounding than any anchor, more dependable than the tides. You argue sometimes, of course, about fish bones left in the stew, about who forgot to salt the herring, about whether the dog should sleep on the furs or under them. But the arguments never last, dissolving like morning frost under sunlight, replaced by shared chores, laughter, and the ever-returning necessity of simply getting through another day together. It's not romance the way the bards sing it, not grand or tragic or soaked in poetry, but it's something steadier, something better. It's knowing someone will help patch the nets without being asked. It's sharing the last piece of dried apple without hesitation. It's waking up before dawn and feeling another hand reach for yours beneath the furs, wordlessly saying, "You're not alone out there, no matter what." One day, while cleaning the fish shed, you find a small piece of driftwood shaped like a boat, its edges worn smooth by the sea. You carve both your names into it, just initials, really, and hang it by the doorframe. Not because you're sentimental, though maybe you are, but because it's good to have reminders, little anchors that say, this happened, this mattered, this is part of the life we built, fish guts and all. Because here, in the land of wind and frost and endless work, in a village that smells of smoke and salt and old rope, love doesn't arrive with trumpets or roses or lyrical declarations. It sneaks in like the tide, slow and sure and quiet, until one day you look up and realize it's been lapping at your feet all along. And that's how you learn. Long after you thought you knew everything there was to know about nets and knots and the cold, hard edge of a gutting knife, that there is more to being a Viking fisherman than fish and storms and cold toes. That sometimes, if you're lucky, the warmest thing you'll ever catch won't be found in the sea at all. Time, in your little salt-bitten corner of the world, doesn't march or sprint or shout. It drips slowly, like thawing icicles down the beams of the boathouse, like rain collecting in the grooves of your hand-carved paddles, like the slow sagging of the thatch roof over your home as the years begin to rest gently upon it. And one day, though it creeps in gradually, almost imperceptibly, you wake up and find your hands are no longer the smooth, eager tools they once were, but are now rougher, stiffer, not from the usual scrapes and brine, but from the steady, creeping toll of repetition, from mornings spent rowing against tides, and evenings spent hauling nets by the light of a low sun that seems to hover longer now, as though it too is tired. You've got children now, plural, loud, baffling, and constantly covered in some combination of ash, mud, and suspicious bits of dried fish, and they fill the longhouse with a kind of chaotic, bumbling energy that you pretend to be annoyed by, but secretly adore. You watch them scamper down to the docks barefoot, chasing gulls and tipping over bait baskets. And for the first time in a long while, you begin to understand what it means to build something that will outlast your own years. Something more enduring than a boat or a net, or even your reputation for being able to gut a trout in under 8 seconds flat. Your eldest, naturally, insists on learning to fish, though with more enthusiasm than technique. He nearly tips the boat the first time you take him out, eyes wide with excitement and completely oblivious to the fact that you're muttering quiet prayers under your breath. Not to Odin or Thor or any of the usual suspects, but to the cold, indifferent fjord itself, pleading with it not to take him the way it has taken others. He drops the oar. He hooks his own sleeve. He calls the gulls sky pigs. And when he catches his first fish, a rather limp, unimpressive thing that seems mildly surprised to be out of the water at all, he holds it aloft like a warrior with a dragon's head and shouts so loudly that the entire village probably assumes you've been eaten by sea trolls. Mainstream fact. In Viking communities, children were integrated into daily labor from a young age, often helping with fishing, gathering, and even boat repair as soon as they could carry simple tools or follow basic instructions. Childhood, as a separate stage of carefree play, was brief. Most were expected to contribute meaningfully by the age of 6 or 7. Of course, not all the children are drawn to the sea. One of them, your second-born, stubborn as a mule and twice as clever, wants nothing to do with boats, fish, or the smell of seaweed. Instead, they develop a fascination with wood, spending hours watching your cousin carve spoons and bowls by the hearth, peppering the poor man with endless questions about grain direction, knife angles, and whether trolls have preferred tree species for their club making. You find it amusing at first, until they start dismantling bits of your boat to examine how it fits together, and suddenly you're having long conversations about boundaries, respect for seaworthiness, and how keel planks are not open for experimentation. And then there's the littlest one, still clinging to your leg more often than not, who toddles around with a net over their shoulder and talks to seagulls as though they're old friends. You're fairly certain they've convinced the neighbor's goat to follow them home twice. And once, alarmingly, you catch them offering your best smoked trout to the sea, explaining solemnly that the waves were hungry. You don't argue. You've made odder offerings yourself. Quirky fact. Some Viking Age superstitions included offering food, bones, or shiny objects to the sea or rivers to appease spirits believed to dwell beneath the waves. Children mimicking these rites was not uncommon, sometimes even encouraged, in hopes it would keep the spirits and the waters calm. Parenthood, it turns out, is not a saga of heroism or grand gestures. It's a saga of small routines. Wiping noses with the hem of your tunic, calming nightmares about sea serpents, some inspired by your own bedtime stories, teaching knots over and over again until tiny fingers finally grasp the rhythm, sharing your last piece of dried apple because someone else accidentally dropped theirs in the fire, and hiding your amusement when they proudly present a fish they caught from the market stall when no one was looking. You and your partner, older now, both of you weathered and less prone to lingering glances across the hearth, still work together as though joined by invisible threads, able to anticipate each other's moves during boat prep, meals, and the inevitable midwinter squabbles between children over who gets to sit closest to the fire. You share eye rolls when someone spills the stew. You pass bread silently when words feel unnecessary. And at night, when the village sleeps under frost and stars, your hands still find each other beneath the firs, calloused fingers brushing as if to say, "We did this. We made this chaos, this warmth, this ordinary kind of miracle." You notice that you no longer rush. Where once you would have scrambled down to the dock at first light, eager to launch and conquer, you now take time to inspect your tools more carefully, to sip your morning broth, to make sure everyone has their mittens before heading out. The younger ones laugh at your pace, call you slow, say you smell like old nets and pipe smoke, and you laugh too, because they're not wrong. And besides, slow has its own rhythm, its own wisdom. You've earned your slowness. There's a moment one spring when the ice has finally receded and the birds have returned in noisy, feathery hordes, when you watch your eldest lead the boat launch, not just helping, but leading. And for the first time, you don't step in, don't correct the rope angles, don't offer advice. You simply stand back, arms folded, a quiet lump rising in your throat like a tide. And you realize you are not the center of the world anymore. You are its root, maybe, or its anchor. But the sail now belongs to someone else. And that's fine. More than fine. You still fish, of course. You still mend nets and bait traps and argue with gulls that seem personally offended by your presence. But your days are no longer only about survival or skill. They're about teaching, passing down, witnessing. They're about holding the hand of your littlest as they ask, "Do fish sleep?" and answering with a shrug and a story. They're about showing the middle one how to carve without losing fingers, and admiring their crooked spoon like it's a work of art. They're about hearing your eldest curse under their breath the exact same way you used to when the net tears just right, and pretending not to be proud. So much of your identity once rested on what you could do alone, how fast you could row, how many fish you could bring in, how well you could predict the sea's mood. But now, more and more, your pride comes from watching others do those things instead, from seeing your reflection in their stubbornness, their laughter, their calloused hands and sunburnt cheeks. You haven't left the fjord. You haven't seen foreign shores or sailed to raid or glory, but you've built a life here, plank by plank, fish by fish, child by child. And while that might not make the sagas, it's more than enough for you. It's everything. And on nights when the fire crackles low and your partner dozes beside you, and you can hear your children breathing in the quiet, fish-smelling dark, you close your eyes, exhale slowly, and know, truly know, that the sea did not take you. It gave you all of this. There are stories that older men whisper near the fish-drying racks when the sun starts sinking, and their joints feel the tug of age. The kind of tales no one writes into runestones because they take too long to chisel. The kind that drift like low fog between waves and facts, always changing with each telling. And one of those stories, of course, is the one about the sea creature, the great scaled phantom that lurks beneath the fjord's shadowed edge. A thing older than Thor, hungrier than Loki, and more elusive than common sense. You don't know exactly when the obsession began, but at some point, maybe on a calm morning when the wind refused to rise and the fish refused to bite, you started thinking about it more seriously, wondering if perhaps the whispers were rooted in something real, something slippery and ancient and just ridiculous enough to make sense in your own personal Viking fisherman mythos. And so it starts, not with a proclamation or a harpoon, but with a thought. What if it's real? You're not young anymore, but you still have enough salt in your veins to chase after something foolish, especially if it gives you an excuse to build a new net that's bigger than anything the village has seen in 3 winters. You speak of your plan in vague tones at first, making jokes over stew bowls and sharpening knives with an air of theatrical boredom. Just in case I meet the Kraken, you say, and they laugh. But then you pack extra oil for the lamps and bring twice the bait and ask the leather worker to reinforce the seams on your net with that serious frown you only wear when something actually matters. Mainstream fact. Many Norse seafarers believed in sea serpents or monstrous creatures called hafgufa that were said to resemble islands, lying in wait to swallow entire ships. These myths often served as cautionary tales about venturing too far from familiar waters. The first few days are uneventful, filled with your usual quota of stubborn cod, suspiciously empty hooks, and enough seagull complaints to make you consider wearing a helmet. But you keep watching the deeper water, past where the rocks drop off, where the fjord's bottom vanishes into murk and old things might sleep. You bait your traps differently, try odd combinations. Chunks of whale blubber, smoked eel, a rusted trinket once found in a drowned sailor's pocket. Because if you're going to summon something legendary, you figure it might prefer cuisine as strange as itself. The villagers begin to notice. At first they tease you, then they worry, then they shake their heads with that particular blend of affection and exasperation reserved for people who have lived too long without going raiding. Your partner doesn't say much, just sighs when you come back smelling like kelp and theory, and gently reminds you that you forgot to bring home bread. Again. Still, the obsession grows. You find yourself staring at the waves like they're about to blink back. You sketch strange shapes in the frost on your boat's wood. You swear you hear something once, a long groan under the water, too deep for wind, too low for whales, something that echoes in your ribs and makes your hand grip the oar a little tighter. Quirky fact, in certain Scandinavian fishing villages, it was common to place carved wooden charms or monster lures into nets, not to attract actual sea monsters, but to ward them off. An ironic superstition that blurred protection with invitation. Your children, of course, think this is hilarious. They start drawing sea serpents on the walls of your longhouse, slipping little cod bones into your pockets with dramatic gasps of, "The monster's calling, Father," and even going so far as to construct a fake dorsal fin out of firewood and rope, which they attach to a barrel and float into the bay while you're napping. You wake to chaos, curses, and laughter so loud you can barely stay grumpy. You let them believe they got away with it, though secretly you admire the craftsmanship. And then, finally, it happens. Or maybe it doesn't. You're alone, early morning, fog heavy and clinging like sheep's wool to the skin when you feel the pull. Not just a tug, but a pull, slow and steady, like the world beneath your boat has opened its mouth. You lean into it, muscles tense, heart thudding, lips forming silent prayers you haven't spoken in years. The net strains, creaks, nearly tips the boat. But you don't let go. You brace your legs, dig in your heels, teeth clenched, face to the sky, as if appealing to the very clouds for backup. And then, just as suddenly, it stops. The net comes up empty, torn, clean through. Nothing inside, just seaweed, just silence, just the sound of your own breathing, ragged, mixed with the groan of your boat shifting in the stillness. You stare at the rippling surface, eyes stinging, not from grief or fear, but from the sheer absurdity of it all. Did it happen? Did you imagine it? Was it a trick of the tide or a prank from Poseidon? You'll never know. And strangely, that feels right. You go home with a hole in your net and seaweed in your boot, and a grin you can't explain. The story, of course, spreads like spilled mead. Children retell it with wild embellishments. Grown men scoff and then quietly ask for the details. Your partner raises an eyebrow, but kisses you anyway. Of course, the sea monster ate your net, they say, deadpan. Try not to lose the whole boat next time. You let it rest after that. You repair the net, but don't fish in the deep channel anymore. You go back to the usual coves, the reliable rocks, the familiar spots where the cod bite out of habit more than hunger. You pretend you've moved on, and mostly you have. But sometimes, in the in-between hours when the mist rolls in sideways and the gulls have nothing left to shout about, you look out past the last buoy, toward where the fjord curves out of sight, and you wonder, if you threw that net again, would it be different? Would it come back with scales the size of shields? Or just another lesson in humility? You'll never know. And maybe that's the point. Because not every tale needs a monster. Sometimes the real story is the part where you went looking and lived to laugh about it. Time, like the tide, rarely makes a big fuss about what it takes. It just pulls slowly, steadily, without apology or pause, wearing down even the sharpest rocks and the strongest shoulders until you realize that those long hours rowing across the fjord have become more memory than motion. And the net you once repaired with calloused hands is now more often mended by someone younger, someone whose fingers are faster, whose back hasn't yet started whispering ancient complaints every time the temperature drops or the sky clouds over in that very specific, you're going to feel this in your knees tomorrow kind of way. And yet, despite the slowness that has crept into your bones, you find yourself standing taller, almost proud, as you watch the younger ones move across the shore like echoes of your former self. Eager, clumsy, and always a bit too sure they know everything. Your eldest has taken to fishing with an enthusiasm that, frankly, borders on annoying. They talk about knots as if they invented rope. They critique your method for curing cod even though they still haven't figured out how to keep the gulls away from the drying racks. And worst of all, they actually wake up before sunrise to get to the boats. You, who once mocked your own father for his stubborn insistence on rowing out before the mist had even finished its first yawn, now find yourself sipping warm broth in the doorway and watching that same determination pass you by in someone else's stride. And yet, there's a kind of beauty in it. There's something strangely comforting about watching someone else struggle with the exact same things that once felt like towering mysteries. How to balance a net just so. how to track the fish without scaring them, how to avoid tipping the entire boat into the water when an overexcited haul pulls harder than expected. You see your old mistakes reappear like specters, mildly soggy, seaweed-wrapped specters, and you smile, not just because you survived them, but because someone else gets to survive them now too. Mainstream fact: in many Viking coastal communities, fishing knowledge was passed down orally and experientially from generation to generation, with younger family members gradually taking on more responsibility as they learned from watching and doing rather than formal instruction. One particularly chilly morning, your son, or maybe it's your niece, the family tree's gotten wide and confusing over the years, returns to shore drenched to the waist, face contorted in frustration, carrying nothing but a tangled mess of net and a spectacularly unhelpful piece of driftwood. You recognize the expression immediately. It's the same one you wore after your first failed catch. The one where you blamed the moon, the boat, and even the fish for conspiring against your greatness. You can't help it. You laugh. Not unkindly, not mockingly, just warmly, softly, with that deep-bellied chuckle that only comes from having been there and come back wiser and wetter. "You leaned too far into the pull, didn't you?" you say, eyes twinkling, voice thick with the kind of knowledge that only failure can teach. They scowl, but their shoulders drop a little, like someone setting down a weight they didn't realize they were carrying. "How'd you know?" You shrug, stretching your aching arm out to point at the exact patch of seaweed still clinging to the side of their boot. "Because I did the same thing. 3 times. It's a small moment, almost forgettable in the grand arc of life, but it lingers, and over the following weeks, you notice they start to linger too, asking quiet questions when they think you're not paying attention, staying just a bit longer by your side when you're mending gear, occasionally even inviting you out onto the boat again, though they always pretend it's because they need help carrying the bait. Quirky fact: some Norse families believed that if a child didn't learn to fish by a certain age, typically by their 9th or 10th year, it meant they had been touched by the forest spirits and were destined for a different path, such as healing, crafting, or storytelling. You know, of course, that they'll surpass you. That's how it's supposed to be. Your hands are slower now, your eyes not quite as sharp, and let's face it, the last time you bent over to lift a net full of wriggling fish, you let out a sound that was probably audible in Denmark. But still, there's something soothing about being asked, about still being needed, even if only as a backup net holder or a source of mildly outdated sea weather advice. You even start carving again. Small things, simple trinkets, mostly fish-shaped, a few resembling mythical creatures with too many fins and not enough sense. You leave them around like breadcrumbs, hidden in baskets and slipped into boots. And when someone finds one, they smile in that quiet way people do when they feel remembered. And then, one day, without much fanfare, you watch from the shore as your child, now fully grown, weather-worn, and confident in the way you once were, guides the family's main boat out into the mist, leading the charge while you stay behind, holding a warm cup and waving half-heartedly because your arm hurts too much to lift all the way. The boat disappears into fog like so many dreams before it, but you don't feel left out. You feel full, like the story has moved to its next chapter, and you still have a few good pages left to read. You spend more time by the fire now. Sometimes you tell stories, half real, half ridiculous, and your grandchildren groan when you get to the part about the sea monster eating your net, though they still ask you to repeat it. Other times, you say nothing at all. Just listen to the creak of the wood and the wind rattling against the thatch, imagining all the nets out there right now, all the hands pulling, all the waves resisting. Because fishing isn't just about fish. It never was. It's about patience and stubbornness, about learning to wait and learning when not to, about casting wide and holding tight and letting go and doing it all again the next day. It's about surviving long enough to see someone else try it better. It's about watching the sea and understanding that it doesn't care about your plans, but it will honor your consistency. You've earned the right to sit a little longer now, to let others rise before dawn while you warm your joints and sharpen your memories instead of your knives. And when they return, wind-burned and triumphant or soggy and sore, you're there, still you, just with a little more salt in your beard and a lot more stories to tell. It creeps up so slowly that you don't even notice it at first. That subtle shift in how people greet you, the way they speak just a bit louder when you're around, or explain things twice even when you already know how it works better than they ever will, or the way the younger fishermen start calling you Old One, with a tone that's somewhere between respect and affectionate mockery, like they're not quite sure whether you're a walking legend or just a barnacle too stubborn to let go of the dock. You don't mind. Not really. You've seen what happens to the ones who fight time, who deny the gray in their beard or pretend they can still row all day without collapsing before dinner. You prefer honesty, even when it creaks. The truth is, you've become the village grumbler, the one who always has something to say about everything, especially if nobody asked. The one who insists that the fish were bigger back in your day, the nets stronger, the storms wilder, and the sun somehow both hotter and more forgiving. And while no one entirely believes you, they still nod along, because there's a rhythm to your voice now. A kind of slow, salty certainty that's oddly comforting, even when you're clearly embellishing. You sit by the fire most days, wrapped in your thickest wool cloak even when the air isn't particularly cold, gnawing on bread that's definitely more crust than anything else, sipping broth and letting your stories unravel slowly, like nets left out too long in the sun. You complain about the state of the boats, the laziness of the younger generation, the disgraceful way people these days don't even bother to clean their fish properly. And yet, deep down, you're secretly proud. Because even if they don't do it your way, they still do it. And the fish still come in, and the village still eats. And that means you taught them well enough to not completely ruin everything. Mainstream fact: in Viking settlements, elders often held an advisory role in the community, even if they no longer participated in physical labor. Their experience was considered vital to both survival and cultural continuity. Your grandchildren, of course, have learned to tune you out expertly. They come to visit, toss a bundle of firewood at your feet, and ask if you've eaten anything other than dried herring this week. You respond by launching into a story about the time you caught a cod that nearly pulled you into the sea, and how you wrestled it bare-handed, only to discover it had been half-eaten by a seal. They roll their eyes, but they listen, or at least pretend to, and that's all you really want anyway. Sometimes they bring you little trinkets, carved pieces of driftwood, stones with holes in the middle, feathers from seabirds you haven't seen in years. You don't ask where they get them. You just add them to your collection, arranging them carefully on the shelf beside your bed, like offerings to the gods of nostalgia. Quirky fact: some Norse elders were believed to be able to speak with the sea in their sleep, dreaming of storms or fish migrations, and waking with knowledge that no one could explain. You've started to dream more too, not just of the sea, but of things you've long forgotten. Your mother's voice calling you in from the shore, the sharp smell of smoke and salt on your father's skin, the way your first net felt when you dragged it in, empty but full of hope. The dreams are soft around the edges, like worn wool, and when you wake, they cling to you for a while, refusing to drift back out into the dark. You talk to yourself more now, not because you're lonely, though sometimes the silence feels louder than it used to, but because your own voice is one of the few things that hasn't left you. It's cracked and slower, sure, but it's still yours. You hum to fill the gaps, mumble your way through recipes you haven't cooked in decades, mutter about politics you don't understand and boats you'll never fix. The others think it's odd, maybe even a little sad, but you know better. You're not talking to yourself. You're talking to the air, to the wind, to the sea that always listened, even when no one else did. There's a bench you've claimed as your own, set near the docks but far enough away that you don't get roped into lifting things. You sit there in the afternoon light, squinting at the waves, watching boats return in slow, wide arcs, each one dragging its own little story behind it. Sometimes people join you. They sit without speaking, or they ask you things about tides, about fish, about life. You answer in riddles more often than not, because you've earned that right, and because sometimes a riddle teaches better than a fact. They say you're part of the village now, like the rocks or the smokehouse or the giant boulder that no one remembers not being there. You've stopped trying to be useful in the way you once were, because there's value in being, not just doing. You are the memory of this place, the echo of salt and storms and stories that still taste of seawater even after all these years. Some days, someone brings you a meal without asking. Other days, no one does. You don't mind either way. You still have your stash of dried fish and flatbread, and the occasional cheese rind you've hidden behind the beam in case of emergencies. You've grown fond of small comforts, a blanket warmed by the sun, a well-placed pillow behind your back. The way the smoke from the fire curls just right on cold mornings. And when night falls, you move slowly, but not sadly. You light your lamp, even if the moon is bright, because habit is stronger than reason at your age. You tuck yourself into bed like it's a boat and you're setting off, even if you're only sailing into dreams. The wind howls against the shutters sometimes, and you smile at it, remembering all the times you cursed that sound while rowing, while trying to sleep, while bailing water out of your boots. It's familiar now, almost friendly. You're not afraid of what comes next. Not really. You've done your part, left your mark, taught your lessons, and told your stories. Sometimes twice, sometimes even on purpose. If the sea takes you tomorrow, it will be like going home. If it leaves you here for another season, well, You've got more stories where those came from, and maybe a few new jokes to sneak in between the old ones. Because that's the secret, isn't it? Not just surviving, not just enduring, but laughing in the middle of it. Even when the fish don't bite, even when your joints ache, even when you forget the name of that one neighbor who's been borrowing your firewood for 20 years. You laugh, you grumble, you exist, and somehow, that's enough. There comes a morning, not unlike the hundreds that came before it, when the sea looks particularly calm, as though it too has grown older and finally decided to take it easy, to breathe more slowly, to stretch itself like a tired dog yawning under the pale northern sky. And something inside you, some small, rusted inner compass that has always pointed you back to the shore, shifts just slightly, nudging you toward the boats one more time, not out of habit or necessity, but from something gentler, something quieter, like the sea itself whispering, "Come now. It's time for a final sail." You don't pack much, just the essentials, which these days means a flask of fish broth, a pouch of dried berries, and that strange little carving your grandson gave you last winter, which he swore would keep sea monsters away, even though it's just a lump of driftwood with a smile carved into it crookedly. You don't make a big deal out of it. That's not your way. You don't gather people around. Don't announce anything with a grand speech or a solemn nod. Don't even leave a note behind, because you figure, rightly, that if anyone's been paying attention, they already know what this means. Instead, you move with slow deliberation, sliding your oiled boots over your wool socks, shrugging into your patched cloak, the one with the fishbone clasp you whittled yourself after that storm 20 years ago. The one you always said you'd only wear when it really mattered. You tie your beard with the old leather cord, the one from the hilt of your father's fishing knife, and you hum something as you walk. An old melody that has no words, but somehow sounds like wind through sails and ropes pulling tight. The boat you choose isn't the newest or the fastest or the best sealed, but it's the one you helped carve, plank by plank, and it still holds your weight without complaint. The others leave you to it. A few watch from a distance, pretending they're not watching at all. Someone's child points and is gently shushed. You don't mind. There's no need for tears or waving hands or dramatic goodbyes. You're not leaving them, not really. You're just answering something. An old pull. An echo older than your own bones. Mainstream fact. Many Viking fishermen, particularly in their later years, would take short, solitary voyages as a form of reflection, tradition, or spiritual closure. Less about the catch and more about honoring the rhythm of the sea and their lives. The sky is that particular kind of gray that suggests neither rain nor sun, just a wide, waiting nothingness above you. And the fjord greets you like an old dog wagging its tail slowly. Glad to see you, but too tired for antics. You push off with the oar, let the boat drift at first, and then begin to row, slowly, with more rhythm than strength. Because your arms remember even if your muscles don't. And every pull is a memory. Every creak of the wood a whisper from a time when you were younger, stronger, faster, but not perhaps any wiser. You head out to a stretch of water not marked on any map, not because it's a secret, but because it's unremarkable. A place between things, between the village and the horizon, between the shallow tide pools and the deeper unknown. And there, you let the oars rest. You close your eyes. You listen. The sea, when you really listen, doesn't roar or whisper. It breathes. It exhales against the boat's hull. It inhales through the reeds on the shore. It curls and sighs and rocks you gently, as if it remembers when you were young and foolish and brave and cold and alive in a way that made every day feel like it might break open into something glorious or terrible. It forgives you your complaints, your curses, your muttered disbelief at younger men who don't oil their nets or sharpen their gutting knives. It welcomes you still, despite it all. Quirky fact: some Viking communities believed that the sea could remember individuals, holding grudges against those who disrespected it and rewarding those who treated it with reverence, often leading older seafarers to whisper apologies or thanks aloud when alone on the water. You eat slowly, chewing the dried berries as though they were delicacies, sipping the broth as if it were something sacred, and you tell a few stories to no one in particular, as if the waves care what happened that one winter with the missing seal meat, or how your cousin once caught a fish so big it broke his wrist and his pride at the same time. You laugh a little, not because the stories are funny, really, but because the act of laughing reminds your lungs that they can still fill all the way up, still make sound, still shake your shoulders and let joy out like smoke. Eventually, you set your back against the hull, fold your arms, and look up. The clouds drift lazily. A gull cries somewhere far off, too lazy to come beg for scraps. You drift, and as you do, the cold seeps in, not harsh or biting, just present, like a blanket soaked through after a long night. You don't fight it, you just breathe slower. The oars lie still, the boat rocks. You think about your children, your grandchildren, about the nets you mended and the boats you cursed, and the mornings you woke up convinced you'd never get the smell of fish out of your beard again. You think about your mother, who once told you that every wave has a name, even if you never learn it. You think about the fish that got away and the ones that didn't, and how, in the end, they all tasted the same when smoked just right. Your eyes grow heavier, not from exhaustion, but from weight. The quiet, welcome weight of having carried so much for so long and finally finding a place to set it down. The sea rocks you, like it did when you were small and cold and sleeping beneath wool and straw while your father sang softly off-key to keep the wind from getting too bold. The boat becomes less of a boat and more of a cradle. The air smells like salt and thyme. You don't close your eyes out of weariness. You close them because they've seen enough. Not everything, but enough. Enough to know the shape of a life. Enough to feel the shape of an ending. You drift. The boat drifts. No one calls your name, and you do not expect them to. You have already arrived, even before the boat stops. You are not afraid. You are not alone. You are not cold. Not really. And if the sea has a memory, then it remembers you now not as a burden or a boast, or even a name, but simply as one of its own. A fisherman who respected the tides, who gave back what he could, who took only what he needed, and who always, always came home. Even now. Especially now, there's a quietness that arrives, not like a sudden hush, but like a long, slow tapering of sound and urgency, a dissolving of movement into memory, where the clatter of life and the rhythm of work recede as if they've simply been outgrown, left behind like worn boots near the hearth. still holding the shape of your feet, but no longer needed to carry them anywhere new. And so it is with your passing. Not a collapse or a grand finale, but a slipping, as seamless as the tide's retreat over smooth stones, leaving the world gently, as if carried away by the very sea that once defined your days and salted your skin. Word spread slowly in the village, not with wails or flailing grief, but with nods, quiet acknowledgments, and the subtle straightening of backs, as if everyone instinctively knows that someone who carried a little more than most, who held their share of storms and quiet wisdom, has finally set their burden down. And the news is not shouted or paraded, but spoken softly from one wind-chapped mouth to the next, usually with a fish still in hand or a net still over one shoulder, and always with eyes that flicker briefly to the fjord, as if they expect to see you there still, hunched over a line or muttering at a knot that just won't hold. Your family doesn't build a stone cairn or carve a monument, because that isn't what Viking fishermen do. And besides, you'd probably haunt them for wasting good labor on something that doesn't catch fish or block wind. But they do bury a fishbone amulet, your old one. The one polished smooth by decades of thumb presses, beneath the cold earth near the high ridge that overlooks both the water and the village. A place where your children can bring their children and point, not solemnly, but casually, with a grin, saying, "That's where old Grumblenet is. He said the cod used to be bigger, but I think he was just smaller." Mainstream fact. Vikings often buried the dead with items from their daily lives, especially tools or charms that represented their work, believing these would accompany them into the next life. The village holds no feast. There is no official mourning, no black garments or sackcloth, but the next night, someone smokes an extra round of fish and shares it with a neighbor. Someone else sharpens the gutting knives with more care than usual. And a child, your great-nephew maybe, walks down to the dock at dawn with a bit of twine and a stone, insisting he's going to catch the ghost fish you always talked about. The one with silver scales and eyes like moonlight. And for a moment, just a moment, the sea seems to listen a little more closely, as if amused by the attempt. Quirky fact. In Norse folklore, ghost fish were said to appear to the children of fishermen who had passed, shimmering just beneath the surface and teaching them where to drop their nets. Legends that often inspired young ones to fish for the first time. Life doesn't pause after you're gone. That's not the way of the fjord. Nets still need mending. Boats still need scraping. Cords still flop angrily on the planks, refusing to die politely. But in the quiet spaces, between the splash of a bucket and the creak of a mast, between the call of gulls and the squelch of boots on shore, you live on, not as a name carved into anything, but as a rhythm, a scent, a habit people don't realize they've kept. Your eldest child still ties their boots with the same knot you showed them, the one that doesn't slip in the rain. Your youngest grandchild still hums the same off-key tune you mumbled while baiting hooks, not because they like it, but because it helps keep the seagulls from bothering them. And somewhere, tucked in the back corner of a shed, is your old fishing knife, still sharp, still oiled, still waiting, not to be displayed or admired, but to be used the next time someone needs to clean a catch fast before the weather turns. As years pass, your stories blur a little. The fish you caught grow bigger with every telling. Your beard gets longer, and someone adds a detail about you once wrestling a seal by accident and winning. Even though that never happened, and even though it sounds ridiculous, but no one corrects them. That's the beauty of memory. It's not required to be accurate, just comforting. And you, somehow, become not just a person who once lived here, but a piece of the landscape, a part of the fjord's breath, the village's rhythm, the salty breeze that never quite forgets your scent. And then comes the day, maybe many years later, when another child is born, squalling and red-faced and smelling faintly of fish oil even though it shouldn't be possible. And someone, maybe their grandfather, maybe just an old neighbor, says, "You know, that one looks just like him." And they all laugh. But also they look a little closer, as if wondering whether something of you might have come back. Not as a spirit, not as a reincarnation, but as an echo, a ripple in the great pond of time, surfacing once again with tiny wrinkled fists and lungs full of stubbornness. So your story continues, not in stone or sagas, but in calluses, in nets passed down, in the rhythm of a boat rocking under stars that remember you better than you remember yourself. You are not forgotten. You are not gone. You are simply part of the sea now. And the sea, in its patient, salty way, never forgets those who belonged to it. So now, dear listener, as we fold away the last line of this story and tuck it gently into the wooden chest of your imagination, let your breath slow to match the waves. Let your shoulders soften as though the salt wind has washed over them one final time. And let the gentle sway of memory and sleep rock you the way a boat rocks on still waters under a quiet, patient sky. The journey from birth to death, from the first fish to the last row, from the smell of wet wood to the hush of a final tide, has been long, but not hurried, rich in small sounds and subtle joys, each woven together like strands of rope that have weathered 1,000 journeys and still hold strong. You've grown, cast nets, lost your temper, told too many stories, fallen in love with fish and faces and the rhythm of things that never needed to be explained, only lived. And now that life, with all its wind-chapped laughter and woolen silences, drifts gently into the wide hush beyond, where nothing is expected and everything is calm. So close your eyes now. Let the fjord fade. Let the boat drift. Let your breath meet the seas. Let sleep find you like morning fog, soft, cool, and complete. You are safe. You are home. You are part of the quiet now.